Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Tonight we're getting into family feud stories. The kind where the people who were supposed to be in your corner, your whole life, turn out to be the ones you needed protecting from. Grab your blanket, get comfortable, and let's get into it. Our first story comes from someone who spent years being the peacekeeper in a family that was using their peace to get away with something they never should have been allowed to get away with. I'm the middle child of three. My older sister is Renata, and my younger brother is Caleb. And for as long as I can remember, the operating dynamic of our family was that Renata was difficult, Caleb was fragile, and I was the one who held things together. Nobody assigned me that role explicitly. It accumulated the way roles do in families, gradually, through small repeated moments where I was the one who smoothed things over and absorbed friction and translated between people who didn't want to talk to each other directly. By the time I was an adult, I had been doing it for so long that I'd stopped noticing it was happening. My parents divorced when I was 22. The divorce was my father's initiation, and my mother did not take it gracefully, which I understood even at the time. They had been married for 26 years, and she had not seen it coming in the way she claimed. Though I had seen it coming from a significant distance and assumed she had too. The aftermath of the divorce reorganized the family in the way that divorces do when children are adults and technically don't need to choose sides but are pressured to anyway. Renata aligned with my mother immediately and completely. Caleb was distressed and non-committal. I tried to maintain relationships with both parents, which both parents experienced as a form of betrayal from their respective directions. My father remarried 3 years after the divorce. His wife is a woman named Donna, who is 12 years younger than him, and who I found, on meeting her, to be straightforward and warm, in a way I hadn't expected and couldn't find a legitimate reason to object to. Renata found several illegitimate reasons to object to her, and expressed them loudly and consistently to anyone who would listen. Caleb took his cues from Renata. My mother, who had by this point constructed an entire identity around the divorce and its injustice, treated Donna as a personal affront. I maintained a relationship with my father and Donna because I liked them both, and because I didn't believe that my mother's pain, which was real, entitled her to dictate who I was allowed to have in my life. This position made me, according to Renata, a traitor. According to my mother, a disappointment. According to Caleb, who didn't use those words, but whose behavior communicated them clearly enough. Someone whose loyalty was suspect. I held my position for 4 years. 4 years of family gatherings where I was the only one present who also attended gatherings on my father's side. 4 years of managing my mother's feelings about this when they spilled over, which they did regularly. 4 years of Renata making comments at holidays that were aimed at me with enough precision to be intentional and enough deniability to make confronting them difficult. The specific incident that broke everything open happened at my mother's 60th birthday dinner. It was a family dinner, immediate family only, my mother had specified, at a restaurant she'd chosen. I arrived to find that Renata had invited 2 of my mother's closest friends, without telling me or my mother, which displaced the intimacy my mother had said she wanted, and had also told my mother, in the week leading up to the dinner, a version of a conversation I'd had with my father about the birthday that made me sound dismissive of my mother's feelings in a way that was a significant distortion of what I'd actually said. I know it was a distortion because I know what I said. I know Renata knew about the conversation because I'd made the mistake of mentioning it to her in passing, in the context of coordinating the gift, and she had apparently filed it away and used it. My mother was cold to me from the moment I arrived, and when I asked her privately what was wrong, she quoted back a version of what I'd supposedly said to my father that bore enough resemblance to the actual conversation to be recognizable and enough distortion to be damaging. I did not make a scene at my mother's birthday dinner. I made a mental note and I went home And I thought about every conversation I could remember having with Renata over the previous 4 years that had involved information about either parent. The pattern I found was not subtle once I was looking for it. Renata had been doing this for years, taking pieces of what I said to one parent and delivering them to the other in modified form, positioning herself as the loyal child and positioning me as the one who maintained divided loyalties in bad faith. She had been the one stirring the conflict she claimed to be responding to. I decided the most effective thing I could do was not confront Renata directly, because Renata was skilled at the kind of emotional management that would have made a direct confrontation easy for her to redirect. What I did instead was have a direct and honest conversation with my mother. I asked for a private lunch, and I told her that I wanted to be transparent about something. I laid out calmly and with specific examples what I believed Renata had been doing with information I'd shared privately. I wasn't asking my mother to take sides. I was asking her to consider the source of certain things she'd been told and to apply the same critical examination she'd apply to information coming from anywhere else. My mother was quiet through most of this. She asked some clarifying questions. I answered them honestly and without embellishment. What I could see happening behind her eyes was the specific recalibration of someone realizing that a story they'd accepted had been constructed by someone with an interest in its construction. She called Renata that evening. I don't have the transcript of that conversation, but I know it happened because Renata called me 40 minutes after I estimated it would occur, which was the same pattern as always. Renata calls when she's been challenged, in not to resolve things, but to manage the narrative before it settles somewhere she doesn't control. I didn't pick up. I let the calls go to voicemail. I listened to the messages, which moved through surprise, then a version of hurt, then something that presented itself as concern for the family, but was actually concern for Renata's position within it. Then a final message, 2 days later, that was the angriest of all of them, and which accidentally contained enough specificity about things she'd relayed between family members to constitute its own evidence. I saved the voicemails. I played the final one to my mother and to Caleb separately. My mother cried. Caleb was quiet for a long time and then said he'd had his own version of this experience and hadn't known what to call it. Renata and I have not spoken since. My mother's relationship with her is severely strained and ongoing in the complicated way that mother-daughter relationships are, even when significant damage has been done. Caleb and I are closer than we've ever been, which is perhaps the only uncomplicated outcome of the whole thing. The loss of a false version of the family we thought we had, and the beginning of an honest version of what it actually is. My relationship with my father and Donna is easy and unencumbered for the first time in 4 years. We had dinner last month, and nobody mentioned Renata once, and the absence of her management of the room was the most peaceful family meal I can remember sitting through. That story is over. The voicemail that accidentally contained its own evidence is the detail that makes this one perfect. Renata was so accustomed to operating without accountability that when she was finally challenged, she got sloppy, in exactly the way people do when the performance they've been maintaining slips under pressure. The pattern the narrator identifies is the crucial thing. Not a person reacting to family conflict, but a person creating it selectively, with information harvested from the one sibling who is trying to hold things together. The peacekeepers and families are always the most vulnerable to this, because their investment in maintaining relationships makes them share more and demand less, which is exactly the access a person like Renata needs. Where the decision to go to the mother instead of confronting Renata directly is the right call made for the right reasons. Renata's skill at managing direct confrontations was, itself, information about how to route around her. Sometimes the most effective way to expose someone who operates in the gaps between people is to simply close the gaps and let the truth travel without an intermediary. Our next story comes from someone who discovered that a family member they defended publicly for years had been privately working to ensure they had as little as possible when it mattered most. My grandfather passed away 4 years ago at 83. He was a man I loved specifically and practically. Not in the abstract way you love a family elder, but in the way you love someone you actually knew, whose specific qualities you understood and whose flaws you'd made peace with, and whose presence in your life had shaped you in ways you could identify and point to. He was a carpenter who had built things with his hands his entire life and who had tried to teach me what he knew about it. And while I never developed his skill, I carry the vocabulary of it still, the way of looking at a thing and seeing what holds it together. His estate was modest in the way that a working man's estate is modest. A house, some savings, tools and equipment, and the accumulated objects of a long life. He had 4 children, my father, my father's brother Gerald, and 2 sisters, Patricia and Wren. The 4 of them were to inherit equally, with certain specific items directed to specific people, according to a handwritten addendum my grandfather had attached to his will. I was named in that addendum. My grandfather had left me his workbench, a thing he'd built himself 40 years earlier, from salvaged oak, a piece of furniture that was genuinely beautiful, in the way that functional things made with care are beautiful, and a collection of his hand tools. Not valuable in the financial sense, valuable in the sense that they were his, and he had chosen to pass them specifically to me. And the choice was legible as a communication of something about what he thought we'd shared. I found out the workbench was gone before the estate was formally settled. My Uncle Gerald, who had taken it upon himself to manage the clearance of the house before the legal process had concluded, a step nobody had explicitly authorized, but nobody had explicitly stopped, had sold it. He'd sold the workbench and a significant portion of the hand tools to an estate buyer who had come through the house during the clearance period. Gerald had not consulted anyone. He had not checked the addendum. He presented this, when confronted, as an oversight. He'd been trying to help. The house had needed to be cleared. He hadn't realized those specific items were designated. I want to be precise about why I didn't believe this explanation. Gerald had been present at the reading of the will. The addendum was attached to the front of the document and was the first thing read. My name appeared in it clearly, and Gerald had looked at me across the table when my name was read and had said something warm and appropriate about how that was exactly right, and my grandfather would have wanted that. The clearance of the house happened 17 days later. Gerald had the addendum in his possession as the informal estate manager. He sold the workbench and the tools to an estate buyer for a combined amount that my father later determined was approximately 1/3 of their market value and a fraction of what they would have brought if sold individually to someone who understood what they were. This was not an oversight. An oversight is forgetting something once. This was a man who heard my name attached to specific items, watched me respond to that attachment in a way that made its significance visible, and then made those items disappear before I could take possession of them. I want to tell you what I did, and I also want to tell you what it cost. My father, when I told him what had happened, was angry in the specific way of someone confronting something they'd been making excuses for decades. He knew Gerald. He knew the shape of Gerald's relationship with fairness and with other people's things. The knowledge that this was consistent with a pattern didn't make it less enraging. If anything, it made it more, because the pattern meant this had always been who Gerald was, and the family had been absorbing it for years. We consulted an attorney. What Gerald had done, selling estate assets before the legal settlement was complete, including items specifically designated to named beneficiaries, was not a simple oversight. It was a potentially actionable breach of his informal fiduciary position. The attorney outlined our options. We chose the one most likely to produce a result. Gerald received a formal letter. The letter outlined the specific items, their designation into the addendum, the timeline of the clearance and sale, and the legal context. It requested either the return of the items, which was not possible since they'd been sold, or financial compensation at fair market value for both pieces. Gerald's response was to call my father and tell him that I was being dramatic, that it had been an accident, that pursuing this, legally, would damage the family in the aftermath of a loss that had already been painful enough. My father told Gerald that he had 17 days to respond to the letter formally and ended the call. Gerald paid. Not immediately. There was a period of additional letters and a mediation session that costs more in attorney's fees than it should have. But he paid. He paid because the documentation was clear and the legal exposure was real. And when the path of least resistance became compliance rather than resistance, he complied. The money sits in an account. I haven't spent it on anything, and I don't know that I will. It's not what I wanted. What I wanted was the workbench, which is gone, which was built by a man I loved from salvaged oak 40 years before I was born, and which I will never own, and which I will think about with a specific and undiminishing sadness for the rest of my life. What the money represents is the acknowledgement that it was taken, that it was mine and it was taken, and Gerald knew it was mine, and took it anyway, and has now, in the most legal and technical sense, acknowledged that by compensating the taking, it is not justice in the way that justice should feel. It is the closest available version of it, and I have made my peace with the difference. My relationship with Gerald is non-existent. The rest of the family has navigated this in the complicated ways that families navigate things they can't fully confront. Most of them treat it as a concluded matter, which it is, without examining what it revealed about who Gerald is, which it also did. I don't require them to examine it, I just know what I know, and I carry it alongside everything else I know about that family, the good and the complicated together. The workbench is probably in someone else's workshop, or someone else's garage, or possibly no longer in one piece. I hope whoever has it uses it. My grandfather built it to be used, and wherever it is, that's probably what he would have wanted, and I try to let that be enough. That story is over. The detail that makes Gerald's action unambiguous is that he looked directly at the narrator across the table when the addendum was read and said something warm about it, which means the items were known and their significance was visible, and the clearance happened 17 days later, with full knowledge of both. An oversight requires not knowing. Gerald knew. The workbench built from salvaged oak 40 years before the narrator was born is the image that gives this story its specific emotional weight, because what was taken wasn't financial. It was the physical object of a communication between a grandfather and a grandchild about what they shared, and that can't be compensated at any dollar amount. The money sitting in an account unspent is exactly the right response to inadequate restitution, not refused, because refusing it would let Gerald keep something he should have to give back, but not absorbed into ordinary life either, because it isn't ordinary money. It's the formal acknowledgement of a taking. Sometimes the only available justice is making someone officially admit they owe you something, even when what they owe is not the thing you actually lost. Our next story comes from someone who spent years as the only person in their family willing to tell the truth, and who discovered at the worst possible moment that the truth they'd been telling had been working against them the entire time. My family has what I would describe as an allergy to directness, and the culture of it, and I use that word intentionally because it functions like a culture, with its own norms and enforcement mechanisms, is one where things are communicated sideways, through implication and omission, and the strategic deployment of other people as messengers, where saying something plainly is experienced as aggression regardless of its content, and where the person who says the thing plainly is always, by definition, the problem. I grew up in this culture and spent most of my childhood and adolescence absorbing its logic. It was only in my mid-20s, after years of therapy and genuine self-examination, that I developed the ability to name what I was operating in and to decide I wasn't going to operate in it anymore. I became, within my family, the person who said things directly, who named what was happening when everyone else was communicating it sideways, who asked the question in the room that everyone was thinking but waiting for someone else to ask. This made me, depending on who you asked, either the most honest person in the family or the most difficult one. My mother experienced it as refreshing about 60% of the time and as an attack about 40% of the time, with the percentages shifting depending on whether the direct thing I was saying was something she agreed with. My father largely appreciated it because he was himself a fairly direct person who had spent 30 years slightly miserable in a family that communicated sideways. My sister Bet, who was 4 years older than me, and who had mastered the family's indirect communication style to a degree I found genuinely impressive, and experienced my directness as a threat to a system she'd been benefiting from, and let me know this in the family's preferred method, which was never directly. The thing I didn't understand until too late was how my directness was being used. My Aunt Cecile, my mother's older sister, was the family's central node. The person through whom information traveled, in whose house gatherings happened, around whose preferences the calendar of family life organized itself. She was charming and generous, and I liked her specifically, not just obligatorily. She asked good questions and remembered what you told her, and made you feel genuinely attended to. She also, I came to understand, used everything she gathered. I had spent years being forthcoming with Cecile because she asked good questions, and I answered them honestly the way I did with everyone. I told her things about my life, my work situation, my relationships, my feelings about various family dynamics. In the spirit of the genuine warmth I felt for her. I understand now that genuine warmth and strategic information gathering are not mutually exclusive, and that I was, for years, providing a resource I didn't know I was providing. The moment of understanding came when I was passed over for something I'd been told was coming. My grandmother, Cecile's and my mother's mother, was in declining health and had decided to sell her house and distribute some of the proceeds among her grandchildren, while she was still alive to see it happen. There were 5 grandchildren, and the distribution was supposed to be equal. I found out through my cousin, Cecile's daughter, that the distribution had been adjusted and that my share was smaller than the others. Not dramatically, but measurably, and without explanation or announcement. I asked my mother about it directly, which was consistent with who I was and which my mother received. With the discomfort she always received directness about family financial matters. She said she didn't know the details. I asked my grandmother directly, which was more difficult because my grandmother was frail, and the conversation required a specific care, but which I felt I had the right to have. My grandmother was vague in a way that suggested she knew more than she was saying, and was uncomfortable with the gap between what she knew and what she was willing to tell me. It was my father who finally gave me the shape of it. He had heard, through the sideways channels that functioned even for people who didn't prefer them, that Cecile had spoken to my grandmother in the months before the distribution decision, that Cecile had raised concerns about my stability, financial and otherwise, that she had referenced things I had told her over the years, things about a period of professional uncertainty I'd navigated in my late 20s, a relationship that had ended badly, a stretch of months where I'd been genuinely struggling and had talked about it honestly, because I thought honesty was the appropriate response to genuine struggle. Cecile had taken the texture of 2 years of my life, during which I was human and imperfect, and had presented it to my grandmother as a pattern, as evidence that I was not the kind of person who should receive the same resources as my more stable cousins. She had done this privately and without my knowledge, and in a way that was specifically designed to arrive at my grandmother through the most trusted possible source, the daughter she'd relied on and confided in for 60 years. I want to be careful here about what I'm describing because I've spent significant time examining it. Cecile did not fabricate anything. Everything she told my grandmother had a basis in something real. What she did was select, frame, and deliver real things in a context that transformed their meaning. The difference between my being honest about difficulty and my being definitionally unreliable was a difference of framing. And Cecile had provided the frame. And the directness I'd practiced my entire adult life as a value had been functioning, at least in part, as a supply line. I did confront Cecile. I want to be honest that this was not my most measured moment. I had been working on directness for years and had developed the capacity for it in most contexts. But learning that the thing I'd considered my most reliable quality had been used against me in this specific way produced an anger that I didn't fully have under control when I sat down across from her. I told her what I knew, and I told her what I believed she had done, and I told her what it had cost me. Cecile was composed. She is always composed. She said she had only shared what she genuinely believed was true, and that she had done it out of concern for my grandmother, who had limited resources and needed to make careful decisions. She said she would never have shared anything about me with malicious intent. She said the word malicious with a specific emphasis of someone who knows the word you can't prove against them. I told her that intent was only one part of the accounting, and that impact was another, and that she had applied a standard to me that she had not applied to my cousins, whose difficulties she knew equally well and had not surfaced in the same conversation. She was quiet for a moment. That quiet was the acknowledgement I was going to get, and I took it. My grandmother, when I told her what I'd learned, was visibly distressed. She is 81 and not in good health, and I was not trying to cause her distress. I was trying to give her the complete picture because I believed she deserved it. And because I believed my grandmother, when given a complete picture, was capable of doing something with it. She asked me some questions. I answered them honestly. She said she needed to think. 3 weeks later, she called me and told me the distribution would be equalized. She did not explain her reasoning to anyone else. She simply told her attorney to adjust the amounts, and the adjustments were made. She did not tell anyone that I had spoken to her, and I did not either. The money arrived with no annotation. Cecile knows what happened. She has not said anything to me directly, which is consistent with how she operates. At family gatherings, she is warm to me, and to the way she has always been warm to me, with the same quality of attention that I now understand differently than I once did. I'm warm back in the way that people are warm, when they understand something clearly and have decided that clarity is enough. My directness is not something I've abandoned. I've calibrated it. I'm more deliberate now about what I share with whom and in what context, which is not the same as being indirect. It's the recognition that honesty offered to someone who uses it as a resource is not the same transaction as honesty offered to someone who holds it as a trust. I still say the true thing. I just pay more attention to who's in the room when I say it. That story is over. The sentence that cuts deepest is that the directness practiced as a value had been functioning as a supply line, because that's the precise betrayal here. The conversion of someone's best quality into a resource extracted without their knowledge or consent. Cecile didn't need to fabricate anything. Selection and framing are their own form of dishonesty, and in some ways, a more insidious one, because there's always a defense available. Everything I said was true. That technically holds, while the actual damage it produced is impossible to deny. The grandmother, equalizing the distribution without explanation, is the quiet justice in this story, delivered without drama, the way real corrections sometimes are. The recalibration of directness at the end is not a defeat. It's the kind of wisdom that only comes from learning exactly how a trust was violated, and applying that knowledge forward, rather than letting it turn you into someone you didn't want to be. Sometimes the most important thing you can do after discovering how your best quality was used against you is refuse to stop having it. Our next story comes from someone who spent a decade believing they were the black sheep of their family by nature, only to discover they had been made into one by design. I was the youngest of 4 children. My siblings, Marcus, Delia, and Trent, were spaced 2 years apart from each other, and then there was a 5-year gap before me, which made me both the baby of the family and something slightly apart from the unit the three of them formed. This gap was just demographic fact, and I never read anything significant into it as a child. I was loved by my parents and included in family life, and if there was sometimes a quality of separateness to my position, I attributed it to birth order and age difference and moved on. The story I was told about myself and my family was consistent and repeated often enough to acquire the status of fact. I was the sensitive one, the one who took things too personally, the one who had a harder time than the others, letting things go. When conflicts arose in the family and I was involved, the resolution almost always included some version of this narrative: that my experience of what had happened was inflated by my sensitivity, that the others hadn't meant whatever I'd taken from it, that I needed to work on not being so reactive. I internalized this story. I took it into therapy multiple times in my 20s and worked on the sensitivity it described. I developed tools for examining my responses to things and checking them against a more calibrated baseline. I became, genuinely, someone with a high degree of self-awareness about my own emotional responses. And what that self-awareness eventually produced, when I applied it honestly, was the recognition that the story I'd been told about myself didn't match the evidence as consistently as I'd been led to believe. The specific incident that opened everything up was minor, in the way that the thing that finally breaks a structure is always minor, relative to what it reveals. I was at a family gathering at Delia's house, a birthday dinner for my mother, and an old photograph was passed around. It was from a family vacation I remembered vaguely from when I was about 8. In the photograph, the 3 older siblings were posed together in the foreground, and I was slightly behind them, positioned in a way that looked like I'd tried to move into the group and been displaced. My mother saw me looking at it and said, laughing, that I'd always been like that, always trying to push my way in. I looked at the photograph. I did not say anything. I thought about the framing of that observation and what it assumed about who had been pushing and who had been doing the displacing. I started paying attention differently after that. Not to the big dramatic incidents, there weren't many of those, but to the texture of ordinary family interactions. Who set the terms? Who narrated shared memories and how? Which version of disputed events became the settled version? How the sensitive label was deployed and when? What I found over the course of about a year of paying this kind of attention was a pattern that had been invisible to me because I'd been inside it. My 3 older siblings had a dynamic between them that had been established well before I arrived, with its own hierarchies and in-jokes and territories. My presence in the family had been, at various points, inconvenient to aspects of that dynamic. Not maliciously, I want to be clear, not with intent, but inconvenient in the ordinary way that a new person disrupts an established system. The sensitive narrative had developed as the family's method of managing that inconvenience. When I was 8 and trying to get into the photograph, the easiest explanation was that I was being pushy, rather than that the 3 of them had closed the frame around themselves. The easiest explanation was usually the one that required me to be the variable, and the 3 of them to be the constant. I am 41 years old. By the time I understood this clearly, I had been the variable for 33 years. I had individual conversations with each sibling. I want to be honest that the conversations were different in character. Marcus was defensive and then, when I didn't back down, genuinely reflective in a way I hadn't expected, and which cost him something visible. Delia was dismissive first, and then quietly thoughtful in the days after, in a way that communicated itself through a changed quality of attention at subsequent gatherings. Trent told me I was doing the thing I always did, which was taking something small and making it about a larger pattern, and then paused and said, to his credit, with real difficulty, that he could hear how that sounded given what I'd just described. My mother was the hardest conversation, not because she was unkind, but because the narrative had been so long in place that dismantling it required her to look at things she had managed for years by not looking at them directly. She cried. She said she hadn't realized. I believe her, and I also believe that not realizing was itself a choice, made repeatedly at small decision points over decades, and I said so gently and let her sit with it. The family is different now in ways that are genuine and ways that are cosmetic, and I'm still identifying which is which. Marcus and I have a real relationship for the first time in my adult life. Delia is trying in ways I can see. Trent is Trent, which is a variable quantity. And my mother is making an effort that is visible and earnest, and sometimes clumsy in the way that effort is, when it's coming from a real place. I am no longer the sensitive one. Or rather, I am sensitive, which is real, and which I've made peace with, as a quality that has value. But I'm no longer the one whose sensitivity is the explanation for everything. That shift in the family's operating narrative is smaller than it sounds, and larger than it sounds at the same time. It took me 33 years to produce it. Most days I think it was worth doing even that late. Some days I think about the 33 years, and I let myself feel the weight of that before I set it down again. That story is over. The photograph is the perfect entry point because it's simultaneously trivial and completely revealing. One image of a family vacation that contains the entire dynamic in miniature, the three of them in the foreground, and the youngest just behind, and the mother's narration of it as the youngest pushing their way in, rather than being held out. That narration is the whole story compressed into a single sentence, delivered laughing at a birthday dinner 40 years later. The recognition that the sensitive label was the family's management tool for an inconvenient variable rather than an accurate description of who this person was is the kind of understanding that reorganizes decades of self-examination in a single reframe. Marcus saying the quiet and difficult thing to his credit is the moment of hope in this story. And it matters that it's named, because change in families is always improbable, and the moments where it happens deserve to be acknowledged specifically. Sometimes the most profound act of self-determination is refusing to keep being the explanation for a system that was never about you. Our next story comes from someone who believed that they had a genuine ally in a complicated family situation, and discovered that the person they'd trusted to be neutral had been running their own agenda through the middle of it. My parents are both alive and both difficult in completely different directions, which means managing a relationship with each of them requires a different skill set, and the relationships don't coexist peacefully. My father is emotionally avoidant in the way of men of his generation. Not malicious, just absent from difficult conversations in a way that puts the weight of emotional labor on everyone around him. My mother is the opposite, intensely present, intensely feeling, and with a long memory for grievances that she returns to, with a regularity that functions as its own kind of control. Between them, for most of my adult life, was my father's sister, my Aunt Ruth. Ruth presented herself as the family's reasonable middle, the person who didn't take sides, who saw everyone's perspective, who could be talked to when the positions of the principals had calcified past conversation. I trusted her in the specific way you trust someone who presents themselves as an honest broker, which is with a degree of openness you wouldn't extend to the parties themselves. For 8 years I talked to Ruth about my family, about the specific difficulties of navigating my parents' dynamic, about things my mother had done that had hurt me, about things my father's avoidance had cost me over the years, about my attempts to have honest conversations with both of them, and the varying degrees of failure those attempts produced. Ruth listened, asked thoughtful questions, offered perspectives that seemed genuinely balanced, and consistently made me feel understood in a way that the actual parties couldn't. I found out what Ruth was doing with those conversations from my cousin Lena, who is Ruth's daughter and who came to me 2 years ago with something she'd been sitting with for longer than that. Lena told me that her mother maintained what she called a ledger, an informal but consistent record of things she learned about family members that she used to manage her own position within the family. Ruth was not a disinterested, honest broker. She was a person who had understood, at some point in her life, that information was the most durable form of social currency available to her in a family where she was not the most financially secure or the most socially prominent, and she had been collecting it and spending it accordingly for decades. What Lena described specifically was that Ruth relayed things I had told her to my mother and to my father in modified form, not fabricated, but selected and emphasized in ways that served Ruth's interest in being valued by each of them as a source of insight and understanding about the children and family members they struggled to connect with. She was, in effect, selling access to my interior life to the very people I was trying to navigate a relationship with, while positioning herself to each of them as a uniquely perceptive and trustworthy ally. The 8 years of careful, honest conversation I'd had with Ruth had been functioning as Ruth's professional development. I took 2 weeks before deciding how to respond. The decision I arrived at was shaped by specific consideration. Ruth was elderly, her health was not strong, and the family's relationship with her was genuinely important to my father in a way that a direct confrontation would complicate, in ways that would extend beyond the two of us. I was not willing to absorb the damage quietly, but I was also not going to handle it in a way that caused collateral harm to relationships I'd spent years trying to repair. What I did was stop. I stopped being a source. The next time Ruth asked me one of her thoughtful questions about how things were going with my parents, I answered in the way you answer when you've understood that the conversation is being recorded, warmly, briefly, with nothing that could be lifted and used. I watched her notice the change in the quality of what I was offering. I watched her try several times to reopen the depth of what we'd had. I let her try without meeting her halfway. Ruth has not confronted me about the change, because confronting me directly would require acknowledging what she'd been doing with what I was no longer giving her. The warm surface of our relationship is intact. What's underneath it is different, and we both know it, and neither of us will say so directly, because saying so directly would cost more than either of us is willing to pay right now. My relationship with my parents is navigated entirely on its own terms now. It is harder without the valve of an apparently neutral third party, and it is also more honest, which I've decided is worth the added difficulty. I know now what that valve was actually doing with the pressure I was releasing through it, and I'd rather manage the pressure myself. Lena and I are closer than we've ever been. She came to me at personal cost. Ruth is her mother, and the conversation was not a simple one to initiate, and I hold that clearly. The truth she gave me was expensive for her, and she gave it anyway. That's the kind of thing that builds something real, and I've found that the things built on truth, even when the truth is painful to arrive at, tend to hold better than the ones built on easier materials. That story is over. The image of Ruth as someone who understood that information was the most durable social currency available to her in a family where she lacked other forms of prominence is such a precise and unsentimental diagnosis of a type of person that exists in almost every extended family. The person who positions themselves as the reasonable middle, not because they're genuinely neutral, but because the center is where the information flows through, and information is what they're there to collect. 8 years of careful, honest conversation functioning as Ruth's professional development is the sentence that lands like a door closing. The decision to stop being a source rather than confront directly is exactly calibrated to the specific constraints named: the elderly relative, the father's attachment, the collateral damage of a direct confrontation. And it works because it removes the thing Ruth needed, without requiring a scene that would cost everyone. Lena telling the truth at personal cost is the moral heart of this one, and the friendship it produced is the only unambiguous good outcome in the whole story. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do with the knowledge of how you've been used is simply stop being usable and let the person who was using you feel the shape of the absence. Our next story comes from someone who discovered that a family member's long-standing financial generosity had never been what it appeared to be, and that the debt they'd been accumulating without knowing it was about to be called in at the worst possible moment. My Uncle Bernard paid for my college education, and I want to say that plainly because the plainness of it is important. He paid for 4 years of a private university, tuition and housing, and the basic costs of being a student, and he did it, he said, because he believed in education, and because he had the means, and I had the ability, and those two things meeting was an opportunity he wanted to help create. He was my mother's brother, unmarried, financially successful in commercial real estate, and he had a reputation in the family for being generous with the people he cared about. I graduated with no debt, and I've been grateful for that fact every year since. I told Bernard so directly and often. I tried to express it in ways that went beyond the ritual thank you, through genuine updates about my career, through the kind of ongoing relationship that treats a gift as the beginning of something, rather than a transaction completed. I thought we had that relationship. I thought the gift had been given, in the spirit in which I'd received it. When I was 32, my mother got sick. Not imminently life-threatening, but serious enough to require a period of reduced work and significant medical expense and the kind of family mobilization that illness produces. I was the child closest to her geographically and the one most involved in managing her care. It was difficult in the ordinary proportions of difficult. The logistics, the fear, the rearrangement of my own life around her needs. And I moved through it without complaint because she was my mother. And there was no version of events where I didn't show up fully. Bernard called me 6 weeks into my mother's illness. He asked how things were going, and I told him honestly. The medical situation, the financial strain, the ways the situation was affecting my work. He listened and asked questions, and at the end of the conversation said he wanted to help and that we should talk soon about what that might look like. What it looked like, I discovered when we talked soon, was a loan. Bernard wanted to help with my mother's medical expenses in the form of a loan at a formal interest rate that he had already had his attorney draft terms for. The terms were professional. Monthly payments beginning 6 months after my mother's projected recovery date, interest compounding from the date of disbursement, a repayment schedule of 7 years. I want to sit with this for a moment because I think it's important to be precise about the specific texture of what happened when he described this. I had spent 10 years being grateful for a gift that I now had to reconsider. In the context of a man who, when his family needed help, that he could provide without financial strain, reached for his attorney's loan documentation. The gift of my education, which I had carried as evidence of a certain quality of generosity, was now sitting in the same room as the loan terms for my mother's illness. And the two things were informing each other in a way I hadn't had to consider before. I did not take the loan. I told Bernard I appreciated the offer and that I would manage the situation through other means. He seemed genuinely surprised that I declined and suggested I was being proud in a way that wasn't practical. I told him I was being clear about what I needed and that what he was offering wasn't it. What I did over the following months was something I hadn't done in the 10 years since graduation, which was look honestly at what Bernard's payment of my education had produced for him within the family. What I found when I looked was a position. Bernard had been the generous uncle for a decade. It had shaped how my family talked about him, elevated his status at gatherings, produced a sustained gratitude that he received with appropriate modesty, and that functioned as a form of ongoing social capital within our family's economy. The gift had not been nothing for Bernard. It had bought him something real, and he had collected returns on it for 10 years. None of that made the gift less valuable to me. I still graduated without debt because of him, and that's real. But the gift and the loan terms together told me something about how Bernard understood the relationship between money and family that I hadn't had the full picture to understand before. He was generous when generosity produced the right return. When it didn't produce a return, he could calculate. He reached for terms. My mother recovered. I managed her medical expenses through a combination of my own savings and a restructured payment plan with her medical providers. It was tight for about a year, and then it was okay. My relationship with Bernard is polite and bounded. I see him at family gatherings, and we have warm, surface-level conversations. And I'm genuinely glad he exists in my life. In the calibrated way, he now exists in it. The gratitude for my education is real, and I hold it clearly and separately from my understanding of who he is. They coexist without canceling each other out, which is what you have to do with complicated people and complicated gifts, and the knowledge that nothing is ever entirely what it looked like when you were young enough to see it simply. That story is over. The loan terms his attorney had already drafted before the phone call is the detail that tells you everything, because you don't call your attorney before calling your nephew to check in on his sick mother unless the loan was already the plan, which means the offer to help and the subsequent reveal of the terms were a single premeditated move rather than a generous impulse followed by a practical conversation. The reconsideration of the education gift in the light of the loan terms is the most honest and precise thing in this story. Not a revision that cancels the gratitude, but a more complete picture of what the generosity was and what it had always been buying. The coexistence of genuine gratitude and clear-eyed understanding at the end is the emotional maturity the story earns. Not bitterness, not naive warmth, but both things held together accurately. Sometimes understanding what a gift actually cost the giver and what it actually bought them doesn't make you less grateful for it. It just means you're finally seeing the whole transaction. Our next story comes from someone who discovered that the family member they'd sacrificed the most for had been quietly ensuring they received the least in return. I am the eldest of two daughters. My sister Petra is 3 years younger than me, and from early in our lives, the dynamic between us was shaped by a simple and enduring fact. Petra needed more. Not as a character flaw, not initially, just as a reality. She was a more anxious child, more easily overwhelmed, more susceptible to the ordinary difficulties of growing up in ways that required more parental attention and more family accommodation. I was capable and self-sufficient in ways that made accommodation easy to withhold, and I was withheld from accordingly. I don't say that with bitterness about my parents. They were doing what parents do, which is direct resources toward the child who appears to need them most. I say it because it's the foundation everything else is built on. By the time we were adults, the dynamic had calcified into something neither of us had chosen, but both of us inhabited. I was the capable one. Petra was the one who needed support. The family organized itself around this understanding with the efficiency of a system that has been running long enough to stop requiring conscious maintenance. I built a stable adult life, career, apartment, savings, the ordinary architecture of someone who learned young to rely on themselves. Petra's adult life was more turbulent. Relationships that ended badly, jobs that didn't hold, a period of genuine mental health difficulty in her late 20s that required significant family support. I was part of that support. I contributed money during the difficult period, covered expenses my parents couldn't cover, showed up for the practical logistics of helping someone who is struggling, the appointments, the forms, the phone calls that require a functional person to make them. I did this because she was my sister, and because I loved her, and because the family's operating logic had always been that the capable one covered the gap. I did not do it with resentment, at least not initially. I did it with the specific form of love that expresses itself through showing up. What I didn't know was what Petra was telling our parents about me during this period. I found out 2 years after the difficult period had passed and Petra had stabilized. and the family had relaxed back into its ordinary configuration. I found out from my mother, who told me in the context of a conversation about an inheritance discussion my parents had begun having with both of us. My parents had modest savings and a house, and were beginning to think about how to structure things, and they had apparently had a series of conversations with Petra, in which Petra had described our relationship and respective circumstances in a way that significantly shaped my parents' emerging thinking. According to my mother, who told me this with the discomfort of someone who had sat with information too long and finally decided I needed to have it, Petra had spent the period of her own difficulty describing me to our parents as someone who had been unhelpful during her crisis, who had provided financial support, but had done so in a way that was conditional and judgmental, and that had made Petra feel worse rather than better, who had made comments about Petra's choices that were cruel, who had, in essence, performed the motions of support while withholding the actual thing. None of this was true. Not one specific thing Petra had described had happened in the form she described it. Some of it had a shadow of basis in reality. I had once or twice said honest things about the situations Petra was in that were not pure validation, but the transformation of those moments into a pattern of cruelty was not a matter of interpretation. It was fabrication. My parents, receiving this account from Petra during a period when Petra was visibly struggling and I appeared fine, he had absorbed it with the bias that had always organized their perception of us. Petra needed support and was honest about her needs. I was fine and probably harder than I appeared. The story Petra told confirmed what the family's operating logic had always implied. By the time my mother told me, my parents had already drafted preliminary estate documents that distributed their assets unequally. The house, their primary asset, was structured to benefit Petra significantly more than me, on the reasoning that I was more financially stable and Petra would need more support in the long run. This reasoning was presented as practical and caring, and would have been reasonable if the portrait of me that had informed it bore any relationship to who I actually was. I asked my mother to tell me specifically what Petra had said. My mother was reluctant, and then, when I held my ground, specific. I listened to each thing, and I told my mother, for each thing, what had actually happened. Not defensively, I was beyond defensiveness by this point, into something colder and more deliberate. Just accurately, the actual conversation on the actual occasion with the actual words that were said. My mother's face during this recounting was the face of someone whose map of a territory is being corrected while they're standing in it. I then told my mother that I needed her to understand I was not raising this to change the estate documents. I was raising it because she had made decisions about my character based on a false account, and I was not willing to have my character misrepresented to the people who were supposed to know me best. In response, relayed back to me through my response, relayed back to me through my mother, because Petra did not speak to me directly, was that she had been in a dark place during that period, and that her perception of things had been distorted by her mental state, and that she was sorry if what she'd communicated hadn't been accurate. If, the word if in that apology is doing a great deal of work. I had a direct conversation with Petra 6 weeks later. It was the hardest conversation I've had in my adult life, not because Petra was hostile, but because she was genuinely distressed, and the distress was real, even though what she had done was also real. And those two things coexisted in the same person across the table from me, and I had to hold both of them without letting either cancel the other. I told her what I knew and what it had cost. I told her I wasn't asking for an explanation that made it make sense because I didn't believe one existed. I told her I needed her to understand that I had shown up for her when showing up was expensive, and that the account she'd given our parents of that showing up was a betrayal I was going to carry for a long time. She cried. She said she didn't know why she'd done it. I believe that too. I believe she doesn't fully know. That the distortions of a difficult period and the family's operating logic and something older and more complicated about our dynamic all fed into it in ways she may not have been fully conscious of. I believe all of that, and it doesn't change what happened. My parents revised the estate documents to equal distribution. They did this without making it a production, and without explaining to Petra that they'd revised them, which I asked them to do because I wanted the correction to be between me and the record of my character, not a punishment delivered to my sister. Petra doesn't know the documents changed. I know, and my parents know, and that's enough. My relationship with Petra is ongoing and genuinely complicated. I love her. I'm also more careful now, not cold, not withholding, but clear about what I will absorb and what I will name when it happens. The capable one is still capable. The capable one is also paying attention now in ways she wasn't before. And the family's operating logic has developed a witness it didn't previously have. That story is over. The word "if" in Petra's apology is the detail that tells you exactly where the accountability stops. Sorry if what I communicated wasn't accurate is an apology shaped to protect the person giving it rather than repair the person receiving it. And the narrator identifies it with the precision of someone who has learned to read those constructions clearly, that the decision to frame the correction to her parents around her own character, rather than the estate documents, is exactly right and exactly generous. It removes the punishment dimension from Petra, while still insisting on the truth, which is the kind of distinction that costs something and reflects genuine values, rather than strategic positioning. The family's operating logic developing a witness it didn't previously have is the most important shift in the whole story. Not a revolution, not a rupture, just the capable one finally paying attention in a way that changes what can be gotten away with. Sometimes the most powerful thing a person who has always been taken for granted can do is simply decide to notice and let the noticing be known. So our next story comes from someone who spent years believing their family's silence was neutrality, and discovered at the moment they needed support most that the silence had always been a choice made at their expense. I came out to my family at 26. It was not a dramatic coming out. I had been out to friends and colleagues for 2 years already, and had done the internal work long before the external announcement. I told my parents first in person at their kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon. My mother cried and then composed herself and said she loved me. My father was quiet for a long time and then said he needed some time. My younger brother, Kyle, who I told the following week, said he'd kind of always figured, and did I want to grab dinner? And the response was not what I would have written for myself, but it was manageable, and I moved forward from it with realistic expectations. My mother's love was real and unconditional, in the way I'd known it would be. My father's distance was painful and gradual in its closing, which it did close over about a year, to something functional and warm enough. Kyle was easy. I counted myself fortunate relative to what others faced, and genuinely meant it. What I did not count, because I didn't know to count it, was the extended family. My father had 3 brothers, and their families formed a significant part of the social landscape of my childhood and young adulthood. Gatherings, holidays, the ordinary density of a large family that kept itself connected. I was close to several of my cousins. I had real relationships with 2 of my aunts. The world of my father's family had been a genuine part of my world for my entire life. In the 2 years following my coming out, that world went quiet. Not suddenly, gradually, in the way that something drains rather than empties. Invitations that had been automatic became inconsistent. Cousins who had texted regularly became occasional. The warmth at gatherings when I attended didn't disappear, but it thinned in ways I registered without fully examining. I told myself people were busy, that lives diverged, that the natural drift of an extended family settling into its adult configurations was accounting for what I was observing. I stopped telling myself that at my cousin Damien's wedding, which I attended alone and at which I was seated at the table farthest from the immediate family, at which several people I'd been genuinely close to throughout my childhood found reasons to have brief conversations with me before moving on, and at which my Uncle Gerald, Damien's father, someone I'd had a real relationship with, managed to spend the entire evening without a single direct exchange. I went home from that wedding and I called Kyle. Kyle was honest with me in the way he'd always been honest, which is without softening that serves himself at my expense. He told me what he'd been aware of for 2 years and hadn't known how to tell me. He said our father's brothers had not received my coming out with the same gradual accommodation my father had arrived at. He said there had been conversations. He didn't have specifics, but he knew conversations had happened, and that the thinning I'd been experiencing was not natural drift. It was a collective decision made without me and not announced to me and maintained by a silence that everyone in my immediate family had apparently agreed to keep. I asked Kyle if our parents knew. He said yes. I asked if they'd said anything to the extended family. He said he believed our mother had said something early on and had been told it wasn't their place to dictate other people's values. He said he believed our father had not pushed it further than that. I called my mother that evening. The conversation lasted 2 hours. My mother confirmed what Kyle had told me and added the texture of it. The specific occasion of the conversation with my father's brothers, my Uncle Gerald's role as the most vocal resistant, my father's discomfort in the position between his brothers and his child, and his choice, each time there was a choice, to preserve the peace rather than push the confrontation. My mother had advocated for me more than my father had. She told me this with a grief that was genuine and that also didn't fully reckon with the fact that advocacy that stops when it meets resistance and doesn't tell the person being advocated for what's happening is a limited form of advocacy. I had a conversation with my father that I had not planned to have for some time yet. I told him what I knew, and I told him what it had cost. Not the 2 years specifically, but the version of the family I had believed I was part of, and the version I now understood I'd been operating in, where my place at the table had been conditional in a way I hadn't known, and my family's primary response had been to manage the conditionality quietly, rather than name it. My father did not defend himself. He sat with what I said in the way of someone who has been carrying a wrong they know is a wrong, and has been hoping the carrying of it would eventually resolve it without a conversation. He said he had told himself that the extended family would come around on their own timeline, and that forcing the issue would entrench positions rather than soften them. I told him that may have been true, but that it had produced 2 years of my reading. The thinning as natural drift, and arriving alone at a wedding to understand it clearly, for the first time in a room full of people who'd known the whole time. He reached out to his brothers in the months after that conversation. The results were mixed in the way that reaching out to people about their values tends to produce mixed results. One uncle came around with more ease than expected. One remains at a polite distance that functions as his permanent position. Gerald has not moved. My relationship with my father deepened through the conversation in a way that the 2 years of managed silence had been preventing, which is perhaps the only clean thing that came from the whole accounting. I attend extended family gatherings now with a clear understanding of the terrain. I am warm to the people who are warm to me, and I'm politely brief with the ones who aren't. And I don't expend energy trying to close distances that the other party has chosen to maintain. This is not the family I grew up believing I had. It is the family I actually have, understood clearly, and I have found that clarity, even when the clear picture is smaller than what you thought you were looking at, is a more stable thing to build on than a comfortable fiction about a larger one. That story is over. The wedding seating is the specific moment where everything that had been gradual and deniable becomes undeniable all at once. The table placement, the brief conversations that move on, or Gerald spending an entire evening without a single direct exchange with someone he'd known their whole life. What Kyle does by being honest without softening is the single most important act in the story. Because every year of managed silence requires a person who will finally not manage it. And Kyle is that person. The father's reasoning, that he'd told himself the extended family would come around onto their own timeline, is the exact reasoning that prioritizes the comfort of everyone who made the choice over the person the choice was made about, and the naming of that is not cruel. It's just accurate. The relationship deepening after the conversation is the proof that the silence had been costing them something too, that the managed peace had been preventing something real, that the honest difficulty finally allowed. Sometimes the family you actually have, seen clearly, is worth more than the family you thought you had, because at least you know what you're standing on. Our next story comes from someone who discovered that the inheritance they'd been led to believe was coming had been quietly redirected over years by a family member who had made themselves indispensable for exactly that purpose. My grandmother lived until she was 89. She was sharp until near the end. Not perfectly, her memory had gaps that widened in the last 2 years, but present in the ways that mattered and capable of her own decisions in ways her family respected. She had 4 grandchildren. I am the second oldest. Her estate was not large, but it was meaningful. A house that had been in the family for decades. Savings accumulated over a long, careful life. Not formally. Not in the language of. Not formally. Not in the language of legal documents. But in the ordinary way that people communicate their intentions to the people they love. She told me specifically, on the occasion of my college graduation, that she had set aside money for me. She said the amount. She said she wanted me to have it when I needed it most. She squeezed my hand in the way she had, which I can still feel exactly, and I believed her completely because she was my grandmother, and she always meant what she said. The grandchild who lived closest to my grandmother was my cousin Harlan, but Harlan was attentive to her in the way of someone who makes themselves present and useful and known. He drove her to appointments, helped with the house, spent holidays with her, when the rest of us were dispersed by geography. I thought well of Harlan for this. I thought it was generous, and I told him so, and I meant it. What I understand now is that Harlan's attentiveness, while genuinely present, had a second function that I didn't see until the estate was settled. The estate documents, when they were finally shared with the grandchildren, bore almost no resemblance to what my grandmother had communicated to us over the years. The house went to Harlan outright, not shared among the grandchildren as my grandmother had indicated to at least 2 of us, but to Harlan alone. The savings were distributed in amounts that were significantly unequal in Harlan's direction. The jewelry my grandmother had specifically described to me was not accounted for in the documents at all, which my cousin Britt told me she'd last seen at Harlan's house at a gathering the previous year. The will had been updated 18 months before my grandmother died, the period during which her memory was beginning to gap, the period during which Harlan was her primary companion and support, and the person who drove her to appointments, including, I subsequently discovered, the appointment with her attorney, at which the updated documents were signed. I want to be careful about what I am and am not saying here. I cannot prove that Harlan influenced my grandmother's decisions during a period of cognitive vulnerability. I cannot prove the jewelry was taken rather than gifted. I cannot prove that his attentiveness was primarily strategic rather than genuine. What I can say is that the documents signed during a period of documented cognitive decline, with the primary beneficiary, as the attending companion, bear a specific kind of scrutiny that the family initially declined to apply because applying it meant looking at Harlan in a way that was uncomfortable, given how much goodwill he'd accumulated through years of visible care. I raised it. I was the one who raised it, which made me the difficult one in the short term, and which I accepted because the alternative was absorbing a significant injustice, quietly to preserve a family peace that had already been purchased at my grandmother's expense. I consulted an attorney. The attorney outlined the specific legal concept of undue influence and what would be required to establish it. The threshold was high, and the documentation available was limited. My grandmother's medical records showed cognitive gaps, but not incapacity. The attorney who had witnessed the signing had no record of concerns, and the informal communications my grandmother had made to me and to Britt over the years were not legally binding expressions of intent. What the attorney's letter did, sent to Harlan and to the estate, was produce a conversation that would not otherwise have occurred. Harlan's response to the letter was to offer a negotiated settlement, an amount that partially closed the gap between what the document said and what my grandmother had communicated in the years before the final update. The offer was not what I'd lost. It was what he calculated I could probably obtain through litigation weighed against what litigation would cost both of us. I took the settlement. I took it because the attorney was honest that full litigation was a long, uncertain road, because the process of it would consume years and resources, and the kind of sustained family conflict that my grandmother would have found genuinely painful, and because the offer, while inadequate, constituted an acknowledgement. Harlan would not have offered money if he didn't know that there was something to answer for. The jewelry question was never resolved. Harlan denied taking it. There is no documentation of a gift. My grandmother is not here to say. And this is the part I carry with the specific weight of things that have no resolution available. The physical objects that held her, gone into a silence I can't break. My relationship with Harlan is non-existent. The rest of the family has navigated this, the way families navigate things they can't cleanly resolve. With a diplomatic silence that functions as a collective decision not to look directly at what one of their members did to one of the most vulnerable people in their care. I don't require them to look. I just know what I know, and I've stopped needing it confirmed by people who have their own reasons to look elsewhere. What I have is the memory of my grandmother at my graduation with her hand in mine saying a specific amount and meaning it. That memory belongs to me, and Harlan can't touch it, and I hold it separately from everything the document said, and everything the settlement implied, and everything the family chose not to examine. It is the truest thing in the whole story, and it is mine. That story is over. The specific detail of Harlan attending the attorney appointment during the period of documented cognitive decline is the thing that makes the pattern visible without being provable, which is the particular cruelty of this category of family harm, constructed to stay just below the threshold of actionable while being fully legible to anyone willing to look at it honestly. The family's collective decision not to look is named correctly as a choice rather than a failure. They had reasons to look elsewhere, and they exercised them. And that is its own kind of accountability, even if nobody applies it to them. The settlement as an acknowledgement is the right way to receive it. Not justice, not adequate, but the moment when the other party's calculation reveals what they know they did. The grandmother's hand and the specific amount and the memory held, separately from everything the documents corrupted, is the image that stays. Because some things can be taken from the record and cannot be taken from the person who was there. Sometimes the only inheritance that can't be redirected is the memory of being loved specifically, and sometimes that turns out to be the one that mattered most. Our next story comes from someone who thought they had left the most painful chapter of their family history behind them, and only to find that a family member had been keeping it alive in their absence and using it to shape every relationship they'd tried to build since leaving. I left my hometown at 22 and did not go back. This is not a dramatic statement. I left cleanly for a job, with everyone's knowledge, and I built a life in a different city that became genuinely and fully mine over the years that followed. I maintained relationships with the family members I wanted to maintain them with, and let the ones that were difficult recede to a comfortable distance. I thought of this as healthy management of a complicated inheritance rather than escape, and I believe that framing was accurate. My family of origin had difficulties that I will describe briefly, because they are the context, rather than the story. My father struggled with alcohol throughout my childhood. in ways that made the household unstable, and that produced in me and my two older siblings the specific adaptations that households like that produce. My mother managed it with a combination of denial and compensatory control. That was its own kind of difficulty. By the time I left at 22, I had spent a significant amount of time in therapy and had a reasonably clear-eyed understanding of what I'd grown up in and what it had cost me and how I intended to carry it forward. My older sister Nina had stayed. She lived 20 minutes from my parents, was enmeshed in the family's daily life in ways I had chosen not to be, and maintained a closeness with my mother in particular that I understood as her own way of navigating what we'd grown up in. Different siblings make different choices about proximity to difficult families, and I had genuinely no judgment about Nina's. What I didn't know Nina was doing with the proximity was using it to tell a story about me. I discovered this over the course of several years of attempting to deepen relationships with extended family members, aunts, cousins, people I'd been connected to in childhood and wanted to reconnect with as an adult. The reconnections were uniformly pleasant on the surface and uniformly limited in a way I couldn't account for. There was warmth without depth, engagement without genuine investment, the quality of relationships with people who liked you well enough, but had decided somewhere prior to your arrival how far the relationship was going to go. It was my cousin Jess who finally told me what she knew. Jess was younger than me, had grown up hearing things secondhand, rather than being the original audience for them, and had a quality of honest discomfort when she brought it up that told me she'd been sitting with the decision to tell me for some time. She said that, for years, she couldn't say exactly how many, Nina had been sharing things about me with family members that painted a picture of someone who had abandoned their family when things were hard, who had left my parents to deal with my father's illness alone, who had built a comfortable life at a safe distance and occasionally visited, but had never really shown up for the people who needed showing up for. Jess said she'd believed this version for years because Nina was present and I was absent, and the present person always has narrative advantage over the absent one. She said something had shifted for her when she'd actually spent time with me at a gathering 2 years earlier and found that the person she'd expected, based on the accumulated portrait, didn't match the one she was talking to. She said she'd spent 2 years reconciling the gap before deciding to close it by telling me what she knew. I want to describe what it feels like to learn that someone has been narrating your life to your family for years in your absence, because I think it's a specific experience that deserves to be named accurately. It is not simply anger, though anger is present. It is a particular vertigo, the sense of a ground you thought was solid, turning out to have been someone else's construction the whole time. Every relationship in that extended family that had felt limited suddenly had an explanation that reframed years of experiences. I'd attribute it to natural distance. I had not been too far away to connect. I had been preemptively characterized in a way that capped the connection before it started. I did not immediately confront Nina. I took 3 months and I used them to have individual conversations with the extended family members I was closest to. I wanted to understand the breadth of it before I addressed the source. What I found was consistent. The narrative had been delivered at different times to different people, adapted slightly for each audience, but recognizable in its essential elements. I had left. I had not helped. I had chosen myself over family. The story had been running for the better part of a decade. My conversation with Nina was long and difficult and produced something I didn't expect, which was that Nina had a version of events she genuinely believed. She believed I had abandoned the family. She believed my choices about distance and self-preservation had come at a cost to everyone who stayed. She had processed our shared difficult childhood through a framework in which she was the one who stayed and I was the one who left. And that framework had become the lens through which she had told my story to everyone who would listen. I told her that her framework was hers to keep and that it didn't entitle her to deliver her version of my choices to every family member we shared without telling me she was doing it. No, I told her the difference between believing something about a person and building a decade-long campaign of characterization was a difference she was responsible for, regardless of whether she'd been conscious of it as a campaign. She said she hadn't thought of it that way. I said I believed her. I also said that not thinking of it that way, while doing it for 10 years, was its own accounting. We did not resolve things that conversation. We have had several since. The relationship is ongoing and genuinely uncertain, in a way I'm still navigating. What has changed is the extended family. The conversations I had during those 3 months opened doors that the decade of Nina's narrative had been keeping closed, and several of those relationships have deepened into something real and mutual in ways I hadn't thought were available to me. Jess and I are close now. She gave me something expensive, and I try to give her something equivalent in return, which is the full and honest version of myself, without the preemptive characterization she'd been handed. So far, it seems like a fair trade. That story is over. The narrative advantage of the present person over the absent one is the precise mechanism named here, and it's exactly right. Nina didn't need to fabricate anything dramatic. She just needed to be there and be consistent and tell her version over enough years to enough people that it became the subtle picture before anyone thought to check it against the subject. Jess's process of reconciling the gap between the portrait and the person is the moral center of this story. She sat with the dissonance for 2 years before deciding that the honest thing to do with it was close it, which is more than most people would do. The vertigo of learning that your life has been narrated in your absence is the most precisely named feeling in the story. And it deserves to be named that way because it's different from being lied about directly. It's slower and wider and harder to confront because it happened everywhere at once and nowhere you could see. Sometimes the most important thing you can do when you discover your absence has been used as a canvas is simply show up and let the people who were handed a portrait meet the actual person and trust that the truth of a real relationship will eventually do what a decade of secondhand narrative couldn't. Our next story comes from someone who spent years watching a family member be celebrated for qualities they had spent those same years privately working to undermine, and who discovered that the celebration had been constructed specifically to make the undermining invisible. My father's mother, my grandmother Adele, was the person in my family I admired most. She had built a small business from nothing in her 40s after my grandfather died, raised 3 children largely alone, and maintained a quality of warmth and presence that made everyone who knew her feel specifically accounted for. She was not sentimental about her own accomplishments. She talked about them plainly when asked and moved on. She had the particular confidence of someone who has done real things and doesn't need them admired to know they were real. Her youngest child is my uncle Desmond. Desmond is 14 years younger than my father and has always occupied a different position in the family's emotional geography, closer to my grandmother in age proximity, more present in her daily life. The child she was still actively parenting when the older 2 were already adults. He has also, for as long as I've been paying attention, been the person most invested in shaping how my grandmother was perceived, and by whom. Desmond organized the family's relationship with my grandmother. He coordinated gatherings, communicated her health updates to the extended family, and managed her calendar in ways she'd asked him to as she got older and found the logistics of her own social life more taxing. He was, on the surface, an extraordinarily devoted son. The family said so regularly. My grandmother said so herself. What I began to notice in my mid-20s, when I was old enough to observe, rather than simply inhabit family dynamics, was a pattern in how information about my grandmother traveled. Updates about her health came through Desmond, and they were accurate but selective. The things shared were the things that generated the response Desmond wanted, which was concern and gratitude for his management of her care, rather than a complete picture that might have prompted other family members to be more independently present. When I called my grandmother directly to make plans, and the plans had a way of becoming complicated. She was tired that week. She had something already scheduled. Desmond thought it might be better to wait until she was feeling more herself. The friction was never dramatic, never a direct refusal, just consistent low-level resistance that made independent contact feel like more effort than it should have been. I started calling my grandmother's landline instead of her mobile. Her mobile went through Desmond periodically. He managed it when she asked him to, which was more often than it should have been for someone whose mental acuity remained largely intact. The landline was hers. The conversations I had through it were different in quality, more open, less managed, more like the woman I'd known before the logistics of her old age had been routed through a single point of contact. She told me things in those calls that didn't match the updates Desmond was sending to the family. She was not as tired as he said. She had opinions about how her care was being managed that she hadn't expressed in family settings, because expressing them created conflict with Desmond, and conflict with Desmond created conflict with everyone who depended on Desmond's version of events. She told me once, carefully, that she sometimes felt like a character in a story someone else was writing, which is one of the most quietly devastating things I've ever heard someone say about their own life. I brought what I was observing to my father. He received it with the discomfort of someone hearing something about his brother that he didn't want to be true and couldn't immediately dismiss. My father and Desmond had always had the specific friction of siblings with a large age gap, more generational difference than closeness. And my father's relationship with Desmond involved a respect for his proximity to their mother that had always slightly outweighed my father's independent judgment about Desmond's character. I asked my father to call my grandmother directly more often. Not to accuse Desmond of anything. I wasn't ready to make a specific accusation, but to establish a contact that didn't root through her youngest son. He did. The conversations he had confirmed what mine had been suggesting. My grandmother was lonelier than the family's impression of her suggested. She was managing a relationship with her primary caretaker that required her to perform contentment she didn't always feel in order to keep the peace with the person who controlled her access to the rest of the family. The specific incident that made everything clear happened when my grandmother was hospitalized for a cardiac event that was serious but not immediately life-threatening. Desmond notified the family 22 hours after the hospitalization. Not immediately, 22 hours later, with a message framed as not wanting to alarm anyone unnecessarily before there was clarity about her condition. By the time the family was notified, the acute phase had passed, and the medical team had a clear picture. Desmond had managed the information until the moment had passed, during which other family members might have arrived independently and spoken to doctors and nurses, and my grandmother without him present. My father drove to the hospital the same day. He spoke to my grandmother's cardiologist directly. He spoke to my grandmother in the specific way of someone who has finally decided to look at something he'd been looking past. What my grandmother told him during that conversation about the hospitalization, about the 22 hours, about the year preceding, was the conversation the family should have had much earlier, and which Desmond's management of information had been preventing. The family had a direct conversation with Desmond. I want to be honest that it was not clean. Desmond is skilled at the specific form of defensive remorse that presents as genuine while repositioning every specific concern as a misunderstanding of his good intentions. He cried. He said he had been trying to protect everyone. He said managing difficult situations was exhausting, and he wished the family understood how much he was carrying. He made the conversation, skillfully and without appearing to, about the cost to him of what he'd been doing, rather than the cost to my grandmother and to us. My father did not let that reframe land. He was specific about each thing: the contact management, the delayed notification, the information filtering, and he named each one clearly and held Desmond's eye while he named them, which was its own kind of accountability, even without a formal consequence. The family's relationship with my grandmother was restructured, Not with drama, not a formal removal of Desmond from any role, but with the organic result of multiple family members establishing direct independent contact with her and no longer rooting their relationship through the single point Desmond had spent years making himself into. My grandmother's loneliness receded in a way that was visible and that she mentioned specifically in calls with both my father and me. She died the following year. She died in a hospital room with my father and my aunt present, and Desmond outside in the hallway, which is not a detail I planned or managed, but which has stayed with me as the specific geometry of how things had finally settled. She had a year of being less managed and more reached for, and I'm grateful beyond what words comfortably contain that the year happened before the end. Desmond and my father's relationship has not recovered to what it was. The rest of the family navigates around this with the usual diplomatic silence. I don't require the silence to be broken. What I have is a year of landline calls with a woman who told me she sometimes felt like a character in someone else's story, and the knowledge that she spent her last year feeling slightly more like the author of her own. That's not everything. It's what there was. I'll take it. That story is over. The sentence about feeling like a character in a story someone else was writing is the one that carries the whole weight of this thing. Because what Desmond was doing was not primarily financial or strategic in the ordinary sense. It was a sustained management of his mother's narrative and her access to the people who loved her, and the cost of it was a woman experiencing her own old age through a filter she hadn't chosen. The 22-hour delay in notifying the family is the moment where the pattern becomes undeniable, because the rationale, not wanting to alarm anyone before there was clarity, is so precisely constructed to sound like care while being the opposite of it. My father holding Desmond's eye while naming each thing specifically is the right response to someone who is skilled at making direct accountability into a conversation about their own feelings. You don't let the reframe land. You stay with the specific thing, and you make the other person sit with it, regardless of what they do with their face. Sometimes the only way to give someone their own life back is to multiply the points of entry until the single gatekeeper loses the gate. Our next story comes from someone who believed for most of their adult life that a family rupture was their fault, and discovered in the most unexpected conversation that the rupture had been engineered by someone who needed them out of the picture. My parents divorced when I was 16, and my brother Finn was 19. And the divorce was my father's initiation, and it was not amicable. My mother was devastated, and the process of it was long and financially contentious, and left everyone in the family with positions that hardened in the heat of the conflict. Finn aligned with my mother immediately and fully. I maintained a relationship with my father because I was 16, and I lived with my mother, but visited my father, and I didn't have the emotional vocabulary at 16 to understand that maintaining a relationship with both parents was going to be experienced by my mother and brother as a choice rather than a necessity. The rupture between Finn and me developed over the 2 years following the divorce and had fully calcified by the time I was 18. He was at college by then, and our contact was minimal. And when it happened, it had the specific quality of an interaction between two people who have agreed, without ever saying so, that the distance between them is permanent. I didn't understand what I'd done. I knew I hadn't chosen my father over my mother. I had simply declined to stop seeing my father, which felt like a different thing, and which nobody in my family treated as a different thing. By the time I was in my 20s, I had developed a working theory of the rupture that placed a significant portion of the responsibility with me. I had been insufficiently sensitive to my mother's pain during a devastating period. I had not been more explicit with Finn about where my loyalties lay. I had failed to prioritize the relationship with my brother in the way that the relationship warranted. This theory was supported by the family's operating narrative, which my mother had authored and which positioned my father visits as a form of betrayal and my maintenance of those visits as a recurring choice to be the difficult one. I carried this theory for 15 years. I examined it in therapy. I worked on the specific things it implied about my character and my relational patterns. I integrated its lessons into how I operated in relationships generally. It was not a theory I'd arrived at carelessly, and it was not a theory I'd maintained without examination. I found out it was incomplete at a family gathering when Finn and I were both 40, and the distance between us had been in place long enough that it had become simply the terrain rather than an active wound. We were at a cousin's wedding, seated adjacently by circumstance, and the conversation that began out of the ordinary awkwardness of physical proximity went somewhere neither of us had planned. Finn said something early in the conversation that assumed I knew a piece of context I didn't know. The context concerned a specific conversation our mother had with him in the first year after the divorce. A conversation in which she had, according to Finn, been explicit about what she needed from him in terms of managing the family's position, and in which she had characterized my continued contact with our father in terms that were significantly more calculated and damaging than the 16-year-old's failure to understand divided loyalty that I had always believed it was. Finn had believed for 22 years that I knew what our mother had said. He had understood the rupture as something I had chosen with full knowledge of the terms being offered, loyalty or distance, and had assumed that my continued contact with our father was a choice made in that context. He had spent 22 years operating from a version of events in which my 16-year-old self had understood clearly what was at stake and had chosen our father anyway. I had not understood clearly what was at stake. I had been 16, and I had continued seeing my father because he was my father, and the alternative felt impossible, and nobody had told me plainly that the cost of the alternative was my brother. The conversation at the wedding lasted 4 hours. We missed most of the reception. I think we both understood that missing the reception was not the cost being paid here. The cost being paid was 22 years of a distance neither of us had fully chosen, and both of us had been maintaining based on incomplete information, assembled separately, never compared, running parallel for 2 decades without ever intersecting. Our mother had not fabricated anything she told Finn. She had been devastated and in pain, and she had told her oldest child what she needed and what was at stake in the specific register of someone who is not thinking primarily about what it costs the listener to hear it. I believe her pain was real. I also believe that framing a 16-year-old's continued relationship with their father as a calculated choice rather than a child's confusion was a framing that served her needs rather than the truth. Finn and I have been building something for the 3 years since that wedding. It is not the relationship we would have had if we'd had it continuously from 18 to 40. You can't have that. It doesn't exist. But it is a real thing, built from real knowledge of who we both are now. And it has a quality of honesty that a relationship built on the incomplete information of our 20s would not have had. We talk about our mother with a complicated warmth that I think is the appropriate register. The love is real, the clarity is also real, and neither of them cancels the other. I think about the 16-year-old me sometimes, the one who continued seeing her father because she didn't have the vocabulary to understand what the choice was being loaded with. I don't think she did anything wrong. I think she was a child in an adult conflict, and she did what children do, which is try to hold on to both of her parents, and someone who was in too much pain to be careful took that ordinary attempt at wholeness and turned it into something it wasn't. It cost 22 years of a brother. I'm not entirely sure how to hold that. I am learning. That story is over. The detail that restructures everything is that Finn believed she knew. That for 22 years, he'd been operating from a version of events in which her choice was fully informed. And that his distance was a response to a decision she'd made consciously. And that the entire architecture of the rupture was built on two people maintaining separate, incomplete pictures that were never compared. The conversation at the wedding missing the reception is exactly right. The reception is the wrong scale for what's actually happening, and both of them know it, and choosing the conversation over the party is the first real choice either of them has made about this in 2 decades. The framing of the 16-year-old as a child in an adult conflict trying to hold onto both parents is the most important reframe in the story, because the original narrative required her to be calculating at an age when calculation wasn't the thing. It required adult intent and a teenager's confusion, and that requirement served the person who needed it to be true. Sometimes the most important thing that can come from finally comparing notes with someone you lost is the discovery that you were both telling a story with missing pages, and that the pages were missing for the same reason, and that the reason was someone else's. Our next story comes from someone who discovered that the family member, who had always presented themselves as the most devoted and selfless, had been running a private accounting of every act of devotion that they fully intended to collect on. My mother's youngest sister is a woman named Vera. Of the 3 sisters in my mother's family, my mother, Aunt Diana, and Vera, Vera was always the one who showed up. She was at every hospital visit, every family crisis, every occasion that required someone to be physically present and practically useful. She drove people to appointments and sat in waiting rooms and organized the logistics of difficult events with a competence that everyone in the family relied on and expressed gratitude for regularly. She had a quality of bottomless availability that the family had come to treat as a feature of her character, rather than a choice she made, which is the thing about people who are reliably present. Their presence eventually stops being seen as an act and starts being seen as a condition. Vera never married and never had children. The family's private shorthand for this was that Vera was devoted to the family, that her availability was the natural expression of a life organized around others rather than a nuclear unit of her own. The shorthand was comfortable, and the family used it without much examination. I liked Vera specifically, not just as family, but as a person. She was funny in the dry way of someone who has seen a great deal and decided that comedy is the appropriate response to most of it. And she asked good questions and was one of the few adults in my family who treated my opinions as genuinely interesting, rather than things to be managed. I spent time with her voluntarily, rather than obligatorily, throughout my childhood and adolescence, and into my adult life. The summer I was 31, my mother had a health crisis that required a period of significant care. Vera organized everything. She coordinated the medical appointments, communicated with the doctors, managed the household logistics my mother couldn't manage during recovery. She was, as she had always been, indispensable. My mother told me multiple times during that period that she didn't know what she'd do without Vera. And I agreed because it was visibly true. 6 months after my mother's recovery, Vera came to me with something she'd been deciding whether to share. I want to describe how she opened the conversation because the opening was its own information. She said she'd been thinking about the future and what it would look like, and she wanted to be honest with me about something she needed me to understand. The register of it, deliberate, prepared, the quality of someone who had scripted the beginning of a conversation they'd had many times in their head, was immediately different from how Vera usually talked to me. She told me that she had kept a record, not formally, not a spreadsheet, but a clear accounting in her own memory of every significant thing she had done for the family over the course of her adult life. The hospital visits, the logistics, the years of availability. She named specific instances with specific dates in a way that made clear the record was not casual. She told me that she had not been doing these things without expectation. She had been doing them with the understanding, never stated, that the family's resources and support would be available to her in the same proportionate measure when she needed them. She said she was 63 and her needs were coming, and she wanted it to be clear in advance that she expected the reciprocity to function. I want to be honest that my first response to this conversation was not the correct one. My first response was a kind of dissonance, the scrambling feeling of having a long-established picture, revised without warning. The Vera I thought I knew had been doing what appeared to be genuine devotion. The Vera sitting across from me was describing that devotion as a long-term investment with expected returns. The gap between those two things was wide enough that I needed time to find my footing before I could respond usefully. I told her I heard her and asked her to help me understand what she was describing practically. She was specific. She expected that when her own health declined, which she anticipated within the decade based on her family history, the family would provide for her care with the same attentiveness she had provided for others. She expected financial support if her own resources proved insufficient. She expected presence and logistics and availability. She had watched the family receive these things from her for 40 years, and she expected to receive them in kind. None of this was unreasonable in itself. Family reciprocity is real and legitimate, and the expectation of it is not a character flaw. What was difficult was the specific way the expectation arrived. Not as a conversation between people who were openly negotiating the terms of mutual support, but as a ledger presentation from someone who had allowed the family to believe for 40 years that the giving was its own reward. The performance of selflessness had been, in Vera's accounting, a long-term contract with deferred terms. I talked to my mother about it. My mother was visibly shaken in the specific way of someone who is reevaluating a relationship they thought they understood completely. She said she had always known Vera had needs. Of course Vera had needs. Not everyone had needs. But she had not known those needs had been accumulating against a private account the family didn't know existed. She said she felt, and I thought this was precise, slightly ambushed. I want to be clear that the family is honoring what Vera needs, not because the ledger obligates us, and not because the performance was revealed as something other than it appeared, but because Vera did show up. Those things happened, and care in a family should not be contingent on the purity of the motive behind its original delivery. The care was real regardless of the accounting that accompanied it. What has changed is the quality of my relationship with Vera. The specific, uncomplicated pleasure I took in her company had some of its ease in the belief that she was present with me simply because she wanted to be. Now I sit with a version of her that is more complete and more human and less comfortable, and I am still deciding how to carry the more complicated thing. The comedy is still there, the good questions are still there. The person is the same person. The picture is just larger now, and some of what fills the frame is harder to look at directly. She is getting the care she needs. The family is present for it. I believe this is the right thing, and I believe it would be the right thing, even without the ledger, and even without the 40 years. I also believe that honesty in the beginning costs less than revelation at the end, and that the family might have been able to give Vera something more freely and more fully if she had trusted us with the terms before presenting them. That's the loss in this one. Not the care, which is being given, but the quality of the giving, which would have been different if it had been chosen with full knowledge, rather than arrived at through the surprise of a reckoning none of us knew was coming. That story is over. The word ambushed is the precise one, and it deserves credit for being precise, because the specific quality of learning that someone you believed was giving freely was actually giving on account is not betrayal in the ordinary sense. It's the particular disorientation of a transaction revealed after you thought you were in a relationship. Vera is not wrong about what she's owed, which is what makes this so genuinely complicated. The reciprocity she expects is legitimate. The family is providing it. And the thing that's been lost is not the care, but the story around the care. The belief that certain things in a family happen because people love each other without condition, rather than because a balance sheet is eventually going to be presented. The decision to honor the obligation anyway is the right one arrived at for the right reasons. And the naming of what it would have been like to choose it freely, rather than discover it as a requirement, is not resentment. It's just the honest shape of what was lost. Sometimes the most human thing about a complicated person is that the thing they kept hidden was a need, not a cruelty. And sometimes that makes it harder rather than easier to know what to do with it. Our next story comes from someone who spent years building a relationship with a parent they'd been separated from, and only to discover that the separation itself had been authored by the family member they were closest to. I grew up with my mother and saw my father intermittently. Holidays, occasional summers, the irregular contact of a post-divorce relationship managed by a custodial parent who set the terms. I did not experience this as deprivation when I was young because I had no comparison point and because my mother was loving and present in ways that filled most of what a child needs. I missed my father in the vague way you miss something you've never fully had. Not a specific absence, but a general awareness of a shape that wasn't there. My mother told me throughout my childhood that my father was not reliable, that he canceled visits, that he was inconsistent about communication, that he cared about me in the abstract, but not in the practical ways that fatherhood required. She didn't say these things with bitterness, or not primarily. She said them with the careful register of someone trying to prepare a child for disappointment, which is a reasonable thing to do if the disappointment is real. I believed her. She was my mother, and she was present, and my father was absent in the specific ways she described him as absent. So the evidence seemed to confirm the portrait. By the time I was an adult, I had a settled understanding of my father as someone who meant well and delivered inconsistently, and I managed my relationship with him around that understanding with appropriate protective distance. I was 34 when I had a conversation with my father's sister, my Aunt Claudette, that revised everything. Claudette had maintained a careful neutrality throughout my parents' divorce and the years following. Out of respect for the custody arrangement, and out of her own assessment of what was hers to say and what wasn't. She told me she had been deciding for years whether to tell me something and had decided that I was old enough, and the situation was old enough, that the information served the truth more than it served any particular party's position. She told me that my father had not been inconsistent about contact. He had tried, consistently, to maintain a presence in my life throughout my childhood. Letters that had not been delivered, calls that had not been put through, visits that had been canceled on his end, according to the account he'd been given, but that he had planned and attempted and been told were not wanted. Claudette had witnessed some of this directly. She had been present for calls my father made to my mother's house that were answered and cut short in ways that, when he described them to her, had a pattern she recognized. My mother had not fabricated my father's absence. She had in significant part produced it, and then described it to me as his nature. I want to be honest that this information arrived like a physical thing, not metaphorically, actually like something with weight that I had to find a way to hold. 34 years of a portrait of a father, built from evidence I trusted because the evidence came from the person I trusted most. And the portrait had been painted by the hand that had also removed the subject from the room, and then pointed at the empty space and said, "That's who he is." I called my father. The conversation lasted 3 hours, and I will not give you all of it, because some of it belongs only to the two of us. The shape of it was this. He confirmed everything Claudette had told me. He had stopped trying actively when I was about 11, because the attempts had produced only pain, and he had told himself that when I was old enough to reach out independently, I would. And when I didn't, he had concluded that I had been given enough of his portrait to not want more. He had spent 23 years in a story where my absence was my choice, and I had spent the same 23 years in a story where his absence was his nature, and neither of us had known the other story existed. My mother and I had the hardest conversation of my life. I did not approach it with accusations I couldn't fully substantiate. Claudette's account was credible, and my father's confirmation was genuine, but I had not been present for the specific incidents, and I was not going to conduct a trial. I approached it as someone who had received information that significantly revised my understanding of my own childhood. and who needed my mother to sit with me in that revision, honestly. My mother's response moved through several phases over several conversations. Defense first, then a version of justification. She had been protecting me from inconsistency. The contact attempts had been disruptive. She had been managing a difficult situation with the tools she had. Then, in the third conversation, something quieter. She said she had not thought of what she was doing as keeping us apart. She had thought of it as managing access in a way that served my stability. She said the line between those two things had not been clear to her at the time, and she wasn't sure it was clear to her now. I told her the line was clear to me, and I told her what it was. I was not cruel about it. I was specific. My father and I have a relationship now that is 3 years old and genuinely real. It is not the relationship we would have had if we'd had it from the beginning, and we are both clear-eyed about that. We've talked about it directly and agreed that grieving the lost version while building the available one is the only honest way forward. He is different from the portrait in some ways, and recognizable from it in others, which is what people are. And I am learning him as the actual person, rather than the absence-shaped space my childhood organized itself around. My relationship with my mother is the most complicated thing I am currently navigating. I love her. She raised me, and she was good at it in most of the ways that matter. She also made a decision across years about what my father was allowed to be in my life, and she made it without telling me, and in ways that required her to construct and maintain a narrative that served that decision. Those two things are both true, and I am holding them both, and most days I manage it, and some days I don't, and I think that's the honest answer about where I am. That story is over, and of the image of the portrait painted by the hand that removed the subject from the room is the most precise description of this particular kind of family harm. Not a lie exactly, not a fabrication, but a construction that required the sustained removal of the person being described so that only the description remained, and the subject couldn't complicate it with their actual presence. The father's conclusion that when she was old enough to reach out and didn't, she had absorbed the portrait and didn't want more. That's the specific cruelty of the mechanism. It produces its own apparent confirmation, and then points at the confirmation as evidence, the mother's third conversation response, that the line between managing access and keeping them apart hadn't been clear, is the most honest thing she says, and also the thing that has to be sat with most carefully, because clarity about the line is not what's required to draw it. Sometimes the most important relationship you can build in the aftermath of discovering a lost one is the lost one itself, imperfect and belated and real, built from who both people actually are, rather than who one of them was allowed to be. Our next story comes from someone who spent years as the family's primary financial support, only to discover that the gratitude they believed they were receiving had been manufactured to keep the support flowing, while the resentment it generated was being distributed to everyone else. My parents immigrated to this country before I was born and built a life here through the specific combination of relentlessness and deferred pleasure that first-generation immigrant households run on. I was the oldest of 4 children and the first to attend college, which in my family carried the weight of a collective project, rather than an individual achievement. I graduated, got a good job, and entered my adult life with the understanding, never stated, absorbed through years of family culture, that my success was partly the family's, and my resources were therefore partly the family's too. I gave accordingly, not resentfully, genuinely for years, with the belief that I was fulfilling something real and mutual. When my parents needed a new roof, I covered half of it. When my brother Marcus needed tuition for a certification program, I paid it in full. When my sister Lily's car died in a month, she couldn't manage the expense. I bought her a replacement. These were not small amounts over time, and I kept no formal accounting because keeping an accounting felt like it would contaminate the giving with a transactional quality I didn't want it to have. What I did not know was that my family was keeping an accounting, not of what I gave, of how I gave it. My youngest sibling is my brother Dario, who is 10 years younger than me, and with whom I was less close than with Marcus or Lily, simply because of the age gap. Dario had the specific advantage of growing up in a household that was slightly more stable than the one the older siblings had grown up in, not wealthy, but less precarious, and had developed a sensibility that the older siblings, who remembered the lean years more vividly, sometimes found grating in its ease. I had no strong feelings about Dario. He was my brother, and I was fond of him, and we didn't have enough shared experience to have a complicated relationship. Dario called me 2 years ago on a Tuesday evening and said he needed to tell me something he'd been sitting with for a long time. Dario had always been more direct than the rest of the family, a quality I'd always liked about him, and which now I understood was about to cost him something in the telling. He told me that my parents and my siblings talked about me differently in my absence than they did in my presence. He told me that the gratitude expressed to my face had a shadow version that circulated privately, a version in which my financial contributions were experienced as controlling rather than supportive, as a form of power maintenance rather than generosity, as evidence of a desire to remain the family's most important person, rather than a straightforward expression of care. He told me that specific incidents, a comment I'd made when covering Marcus's tuition, about the value of completing what you start, a follow-up question I'd asked Lily about her car insurance after replacing her car, had been narrated and re-narrated in my absence as examples of condescension and judgment dressed as help. He told me that at a family gathering 6 months earlier, at which I had not been present, a conversation about money had turned into a 2-hour discussion of my various failures as a person, conducted with the fluency and specificity of people who had been having versions of this conversation for years. He told me because, he said, he had sat at that gathering and listened to 2 hours of it and had looked around the room and thought about the Tuesday evenings I spent managing family expenses instead of my own life, and had decided that the person being discussed deserved to know what was being said. I asked him why he hadn't been part of those conversations before. He said he had been in milder versions, and that the gathering 6 months ago had been different in scale and intensity from what he'd participated in previously, and that the difference had been enough to locate a line he hadn't known he was going to find, until he was standing on the wrong side of it. I sat with what Dario told me for 2 weeks. I did not spend those 2 weeks in clean anger, which would have been simpler. I spent them in the specific complexity of someone examining whether the criticisms being made of them had any basis, because I am not someone who can dismiss the possibility that I have flaws simply because the people naming them had been naming them behind my back. I thought carefully about the comment to Marcus, about the insurance question to Lily. I looked for the version of those moments that would be fair to the person who had experienced them, and I found it. There was a version of each in which I had been slightly more invested in the outcome of my giving than pure generosity would have been. I owned that. I took it into my own accounting, and I gave it appropriate weight. What I did not give appropriate weight to the idea that the private 2-hour conversation had been a proportionate response to the specific imperfections of a person who had been showing up financially for years. The scale was wrong, and the privacy was wrong, and the duration and the specificity were wrong, and those things were not about the merits of the criticism. They were about something else. The particular dynamic that develops when one person in a family is consistently in the position of provider, and the other members process their feelings about that position collectively and privately, rather than directly with the person who holds it. I had individual conversations with Marcus, Lily, and my parents. I want to be honest that the conversations were different from each other and produced different things. My mother was the most distressed. She had participated in the conversations and she knew it. and the distress was the real thing. My father was quiet in the way of someone who has made a choice they know was wrong and is not sure how to be specific about it. Marcus was defensive first, and then, after some difficulty, honest in a way that cost him something. Lily said things that were too carefully managed to be fully honest, and I noted that, and moved on because pushing harder would not have produced more truth. I told each of them the same thing in different registers. I was not going to change who I was in the family based on private characterizations of who I was that had circulated without me. If there were specific things I did that felt more like control than care, I needed them to tell me directly so I could examine them honestly. What I was not going to do was continue giving in a context where the giving was being experienced as something to resent and talked about as something to resent, because that arrangement didn't work for anyone, and continuing it would make me someone I didn't want to be. The family's relationship with my financial support changed after those conversations, not because I withdrew it, I didn't, not entirely, but because something about the conversations changed the texture of how it was offered and received. I have been more direct about my own limits since then, less instinctively available, more deliberate about when I give and what I say about it. Whether this represents improvement or damage depends on who you ask, and I have made my peace with that ambiguity. My relationship with Dario is the clearest thing that came out of it. He called me on a Tuesday evening, and he told me the truth at personal cost, and then he sat with the consequences of having told it, which included a complicated period with the rest of the family that he navigated without complaint. I am closer to him now than to any of my other siblings, and I hold that clearly as the thing the whole painful accounting produced that was worth having. That story is over. The 2-hour conversation at a gathering the narrator wasn't present for is the specific thing that changes the scale of what was happening. Because private frustrations about a family member's giving style are human and manageable, but a fluent, sustained group conversation that has clearly been rehearsed across years is something different. It's a shared project, and the narrator is right to feel the difference, even if the individual criticisms within it had some basis. The fact that they spent 2 weeks examining whether the criticisms were fair, rather than dismissing them entirely, is the most honest and self-respecting response available, owning the kernel of truth inside the distorted version, without letting the distortion define the whole picture. Dario finding the line at the gathering and deciding which side of it he was going to stand on is the moral act in this story, and it is genuinely costly in ways he knew it would be when he made the call. Sometimes being the person who tells the truth in a family where everyone else has agreed to manage it is the loneliest position available, and also the most valuable one, and the person who does it deserves to be told that directly. Our next story comes from someone who discovered that a long-standing family tradition had been functioning as a cover for something that only one person in the family fully understood and had been carefully maintaining. Every year for as long as I can remember, my mother's family gathered at my grandmother's house for a week in the summer. The house was large, a Victorian in coastal Maine that had been in the family for 3 generations. And the week was the organizing event of the family's year, in the way that certain gatherings become the architecture around which the rest of life is arranged. Cousins, aunts, uncles, and the gradual addition of spouses and children over the years. At its largest, the gathering involved 23 people across 4 generations, and the house held all of us in the specific, contained intimacy of a shared space that everyone knew by heart. The gathering was organized by my Aunt Helen, who was my grandmother's eldest child, and who had taken on the logistics of it when my grandmother's age made the organizing more than she could manage alone. Helen was efficient and thorough, and the gathering happened every year with the reliability that comes from someone who has decided it will happen and made that decision non-negotiable. The family was grateful. We said so. And what the family didn't know, or didn't know in any consolidated way, was that Helen had been using her organizational role to manage something the gathering was producing that she hadn't shared with anyone else. The house had been appraised 3 years earlier. The appraisal had been Helen's initiative, which she had not announced to the family. The house was worth significantly more than anyone except Helen apparently knew, and Helen had been in conversations with a developer, also not announced, about a potential sale that would have distributed the proceeds and ended the gathering and the family's relationship with the house that had held us for 3 generations. I found out from a cousin named Patrick, whose wife worked in real estate, and who had, by professional accident, they encountered the developer's name in a context that connected it to a property she recognized. Patrick had been sitting with this for 2 months before he told me, which was itself information about how difficult the telling was. The house belonged to my grandmother, who was 91, and whose formal cognitive capacity was intact, but whose daily management of her own affairs had been largely delegated to Helen for the previous 4 years. My grandmother knew the house had been appraised because Helen had told her it was routine. She did not know there had been developer conversations because Helen had not told her. The decision about whether to sell a house that had been in the family for 3 generations, that had held 4 generations of a family for a week every summer, that my grandmother had never expressed any intention to sell. That decision had been under active development by a single family member, without the knowledge of the person who owned it or the family who shared it. I want to be careful about Helen because Helen is not a villain in the ordinary sense. She had been managing the gathering and the house for years, at genuine personal cost. The logistics were significant. The maintenance of an old house required ongoing attention and money and time, and Helen had been the one providing all of it without consistent financial support from the siblings who also benefited from the gathering. Her motive for the sale, when it became clear, was not personal financial gain in a simple sense, and it was the exhaustion of someone who had been carrying something large alone for years and had arrived at a private conclusion that the carrying needed to end. The problem was not the conclusion. The problem was the method, the unilateral, undisclosed approach to a decision that belonged to her mother and to the family, managed in secret until the moment a sale would have been presented as a fait accompli. Patrick and I went to my grandmother first. We asked her directly whether she had any knowledge of developer conversations about the property. She did not. We showed her the documentation Patrick's wife had assembled, the appraisal record, the developer's name, the context of the contact. My grandmother was quiet for a long time. Then she asked us to get Helen. The conversation that followed, my grandmother, Helen, Patrick, and me, was one of the most uncomfortable things I have sat through in a family life that has contained some uncomfortable things. Helen did not deny what she'd done. She explained it in the way that people explain things when they believe the explanation will function as a justification, which in this case it didn't. Not because the exhaustion wasn't real, and not because the burden wasn't real, but because the decision about what to do with that burden was not Helen's alone to make, and she had made it alone anyway. My grandmother said 2 things that I will carry for the rest of my life. She said she understood that Helen was tired, and that she should have asked Helen long ago what the carrying cost her, and that she was sorry she hadn't. Then she said that the house would be sold when she decided it would be sold, and that Helen was welcome to step back from the organizing if the organizing had become too much, and that the family would find another way to manage it, and that she would like to speak to Helen alone now. We don't know what was said in that conversation. My grandmother did not share it, and Helen did not share it, and we have not asked. The gathering has happened every summer since. Helen no longer organizes it. She stepped back, as my grandmother offered, and the organizing has been distributed among 4 cousins, who share it in rotation. The house has not been sold. My grandmother is 93, and the house is hers, and when she decides what happens to it, the family will hear about it from her. My relationship with Helen is warm in the surface way. and complicated underneath in a way I suspect is permanent. She did what she did from real exhaustion and real need, and I hold that clearly. She also made a decision about the family's most significant shared possession and its future without telling the family. And that decision, if completed, would have been irreversible, and I hold that clearly too. Both things are true, and neither cancels the other, and that's the texture of how I know her now. The week in Maine happened last August. 21 people this time. Some have aged out of the gathering in the permanent way, and some new ones have been added. The house held us the way it always has, and my grandmother sat in her chair on the porch in the evenings and watched the water, and I sat beside her more evenings than I usually do, and we talked about things that weren't difficult and some things that were, and it was the kind of time, while you're in it, that you'll return to. That story is over. The grandmother's two-part response is the moral compass of the whole story. The acknowledgement of what her inattention to Helen's burden had cost. Offered first, before the correction, which is the order that only someone who is genuinely wise chooses. She sees the full picture and she responds to both parts of it, and she does so with a clarity and a dignity that makes the private conversation with Helen the right conclusion, rather than the family's collective judgment. Patrick finding the developer's name through professional accident is the specific ordinary mechanism of how these things surface. Not investigation, not confrontation, just the ordinary overlap of lives in a world where information travels and someone in the room finally knows what to do with it. The gathering continuing, the house still standing, the grandmother in her chair on the porch watching the water. Those are the images that carry the weight of what was almost lost and wasn't. Sometimes the most important thing you can do with knowledge of what someone almost took from you is choose, consciously, to let the thing itself be the answer. Our next story comes from someone who discovered that a family member they'd supported through a difficult legal situation had been using the support to fund a version of events that didn't match the one the family believed they were supporting. My brother Ellis was arrested 4 years ago on charges that I'm not going to specify, beyond saying they were serious enough to require a significant legal defense. The family's response was immediate and collective. We believed Ellis, we supported Ellis, we hired an attorney we couldn't comfortably afford, and we paid for it together from savings and a loan my parents took against their house and contributions from me and my sister that represented significant portions of what we had. I want to be honest that the decision to support Ellis financially was not uncomplicated even at the time. He had a history of decisions that had required family intervention and family resources, and the support provided on those previous occasions had not always produced the outcomes we'd hoped for. But he was family, and the situation was serious. And the principle of believing your family member, until you have specific reason not to, is one we held and we acted on it. Ellis's attorney negotiated a plea arrangement that resulted in a reduced charge and a sentence that involved probation rather than incarceration. The family was relieved in the specific way of people who have spent a year in fear of a worse outcome. We absorbed the financial cost without discussion. It had been spent. The outcome was as good as it could have been. Moving forward was the priority. What I found out 14 months after the case concluded was that the version of events Ellis had told us, the version we had financed the defense of, was not the version Ellis had told his attorney. His attorney, who was bound by privilege while the case was active and whose privilege, on specific elements, had concluded with the resolution, told me something I had not sought out and which arrived as a consequence of a conversation I'd initiated for a different reason entirely. I had reached out to the attorney to ask about the possibility of having the record expunged at the appropriate time, as a gesture of continued support for Ellis's ability to rebuild professionally. The attorney's response contained an assumption about what I already knew that I didn't know. Ellis had not been in position by circumstance the way he told us he had been. The charges were not the result of a misunderstanding or a situation he'd been drawn into by someone else. He had known what he was doing and had been doing it for longer than the specific incident that produced the arrest. The attorney had been building a defense around specific mitigating factors that were real and had done good work, but the foundational story Ellis had told his family, the story we had sold our financial security to defend, was a construction. I sat with this for a month. I did not tell my parents, who were in their 70s and whose financial recovery from the legal expense is still ongoing, and who had operated from a belief in their son that I did not want to damage without careful consideration of what the damage would produce for them. I did not tell my sister immediately, though I told her eventually because she had contributed as I had, and she had the same right to the complete picture. What I did was have a conversation with Ellis. I told him what I'd learned and how I'd learned it, and I told him I was not there to relitigate the case or to perform an emotion I didn't fully feel yet. I told him I was there to understand what had actually happened, as specifically as he was able to tell me, because I had made a significant decision based on a story he had told me, and I wanted to make that decision with accurate information, even retrospectively. Ellis did not deny it. He had the specific quality of someone who has been waiting for a conversation they knew was coming and is almost relieved when it arrives. He told me the shape of what he'd actually done. He was not proud of it, and the lack of pride seemed genuine rather than performed. He said he had told us the story he told us, because it was the story that would produce the support he needed, and he had needed the support. He said he understood that reasoning was insufficient. He said he was sorry. I asked him one specific question that I needed answered. I asked him whether he had ever intended to tell us the truth. He was quiet for a long time, and then he said he had told himself he would tell us when things had settled enough, that the telling wouldn't cost him the family support, and that things had never quite settled enough, and that the settling threshold had kept moving in the direction that kept the truth deferred. I told him that was the most honest thing he'd said in 4 years, and I meant it without cruelty. My parents do not know the full version. I have made the decision not to tell them because of their health and age make the specific cost of the information higher than what it would produce for them in terms of, anything useful. My sister and I have talked about this decision, and we agree on it. This is not a decision I made lightly, and it is not one I'm entirely comfortable with, and I carry the discomfort as part of the accounting. Ellis and I have a relationship. It is smaller than it was, and different in quality. Not absent, not cold, but bounded in specific ways that reflect what I now know about how he operates when he needs something. And the truth is an obstacle to getting it. I help him in ways that are direct and limited and visible. I do not offer anything that depends on my ability to trust a version of events he provides without independent verification. This is not a punishment, it is just the calibration of trust to the information available, which is what trust is supposed to be. That story is over. The settling threshold that kept moving into the direction that kept the truth deferred is the most precise and honest description of the specific psychology of someone who intends to come clean, but locates the right moment always slightly ahead of where they are. It's not lying exactly. It's a continuous deferral that functionally produces the same result as never telling at all. The decision not to tell the parents is genuinely complicated, and the narrator names the complexity honestly, rather than defending it too easily. They carry the discomfort rather than resolving it into certainty, which is the intellectually honest thing to do with a choice that has no clean version. The calibration of the ongoing relationship to the information now available, bounded, direct, limited, visible, is the right model for maintaining a connection with someone you love and can no longer trust fully. And the naming of it as calibration rather than punishment is the distinction that makes it sustainable rather than corrosive. And Sometimes the most you can do with a family member who used your belief in them against you is decide what belief you still have available and offer exactly that, no more and no less. Our next story comes from someone who discovered that the family narrative they had been raised inside had been authored by a single person with a specific interest in its contents, and that dismantling it required confronting not just the person who built it, but the family members who had found it comfortable to live inside. I have a large extended family on my mother's side, 13 cousins, 5 aunts and uncles, a density of family life that was warm and enveloping throughout my childhood, and that I carried as one of the central goods of my early life. The center of that family, its organizing intelligence, was my Uncle Philip, who was the eldest of my mother's siblings, and who operated with the specific authority that birth order and personality combined to produce, in someone who has never had reason to question either. Philip told stories. This was his social gift, and it was genuine. He was funny and specific, and could hold a room with a dinner table anecdote in a way that made gatherings genuinely better for his presence. He told stories about the family's history, about his own childhood, about the extended cast of relatives and friends whose lives intersected with the family's over decades. He was the family's memory, or he was understood to be, which is a different thing. I began to notice in my late 20s that the stories Philip told about family members had a consistent shape. The shape was not malicious exactly. It wasn't that people came out badly in his stories. It was that they came out in specific ways that corresponded to specific positions in a hierarchy Philip maintained through the telling. The cousin who had been the most academically successful was always mentioned with a quality of faint qualification. Brilliant, of course, but the aunt who had built the most impressive professional life was always contextualized by her personal difficulties. The family member who had most directly challenged Philip's authority on any occasion was characterized by a trait that explained the challenge as a limitation, rather than a legitimate perspective. I was one of the people who had challenged Philip directly on one occasion, at a family gathering in my mid-20s, and about something I'm not going to detail, but that involved a decision that affected family members who didn't have a voice in it. The challenge had been polite and specific, and had not been received well. From that point on, I noticed that the stories Philip told about me had a new quality. Not hostile, but with a gentle, consistent emphasis on qualities that were gently diminishing. I was headstrong. I had strong opinions. I was independent in ways that were admirable, but also, with a smile, somewhat exhausting. I want to be honest that I didn't take this personally for years, because I thought I was reading something into the stories that wasn't there. My cousins seemed to receive the stories without the subtext I was reading. My mother, who loved Philip, didn't see it. I told myself I was being sensitive, and I moved on. What changed my assessment was a conversation with my cousin Nadia, who was Philip's own daughter, who came to me at a family gathering when I was 36, with something she'd been deciding to say for longer than I'd been aware there was something to say. Nadia told me that she had grown up watching her father manage the family's perception of its members through the stories he told, and she had normalized it so thoroughly that she had not been able to name it clearly until she'd spent 3 years in therapy developing the vocabulary. She told me that the management was intentional, not always consciously, but with the specific intentionality of a person who has discovered that narrative is the most durable tool available and who has never stopped using it. She told me that the stories about me had changed in a specific way. After the gathering where I challenged him, and she named the change precisely, and I felt the specific relief of someone who has been reading something correctly and has been told so. She told me this at personal cost that I want to name clearly. Philip was her father, and she loved him, and the conversation had required her to hold both her love for him and her honesty about him simultaneously, which is the hardest kind of conversation a person can have. I did not confront Philip directly. I made this decision not from conflict avoidance, but from a clear assessment of what a direct confrontation would produce. A skilled storyteller told that his stories are a management tool, would produce a story about being misunderstood, and that story would be told to the family. And it would be better than anything I could counter it with. What I did instead was something slower. I started telling my own stories. At family gatherings, I contributed to the family's narrative directly, rather than being a subject of someone else's. I was specific and warm and funny, and I made sure the picture I offered of myself was accurate and dimensional, rather than the gently diminishing version that had been circulating. I connected individually with cousins and aunts and uncles in ways that existed outside of Philip's gatherings and Philip's narration. I built direct relationships that didn't root through the family's central storyteller. The change was slow, and the results were incomplete, and some family members will always hold a version of me that Philip's telling constructed. I've made my peace with that. What I've gained is a set of relationships that I built directly, that know me from the inside rather than from someone else's outside, that have a quality of authenticity that the mediated versions never had. Philip is in his late 70s now. The stories continue, and I expect they always will. I sit at family gatherings and I listen to them with the specific clarity of someone who knows how they work, and I feel, if I'm honest, a complicated mixture of things. The genuine appreciation for the gift of them, the awareness of the management inside them, the sadness of knowing that a person spent a lifetime using a real talent for a purpose that diminished the people around him. It is a complicated mixture to sit with, and I sit with it, because the alternative is pretending it's simpler than it is. Nadia and I are close. She told me the truth about her own father, and then she stayed in the room with the consequences. I don't know a better description of courage than that. That story is over. The specific shape of the Philip stories, not making people come out badly, but making them come out in ways that corresponded to their position in his hierarchy, is the most sophisticated and therefore most insidious version of narrative management, because it has a plausible deniability that cruder versions don't. The cousin who challenged him getting a new quality, and the stories after the challenge is the mechanism revealed clearly, the storytelling tool deployed as consequence management. Well, the decision to counter it, not with confrontation, but with the slow construction of direct relationships that don't route through him, is exactly right. You don't win a storytelling contest against the family's designated storyteller. You build an audience that heard you firsthand. Nadia's act of telling her father's truth at the cost of her own comfort in the relationship is the kind of courageous honesty that deserves to be named, specifically because it costs something a daughter pays with a part of herself that can't be fully recovered. Sometimes the only way to live inside a family whose narrative has been managed against you is to become your own narrator and tell your own story, loudly enough and directly enough, that the managed version eventually has to share the room with the real one. Our next story comes from someone who spent years believing a sibling rivalry was the natural friction of two different personalities, and discovered it had been a coordinated campaign with a specific financial objective that only became visible when the objective was almost achieved. My sister Ren and I are 3 years apart and have always been different in the ways that families produce complementary opposites. She was social and expressive, where I was quieter and more internal. She moved through the world with an ease in rooms full of people that I envied without resentment. I had a patience with detail and process that she lacked and that she sometimes borrowed through me. We were not close in the way of siblings who are also friends, but we were functional in the way of siblings who understand each other's operating systems well enough to coexist without significant friction. The friction that existed between us I understood, for most of our adult lives, as the ordinary product of different values, meeting at family pressure points. Ren spent freely, and I saved carefully, and this difference produced occasional tension around shared family expenses, without ever fully rupturing anything. She was more openly affectionate with our parents in ways that gave her a social warmth with them that my quieter presence didn't generate, and I had made my peace with that difference without reading it as a competition. I was 38 when I understood it had been a competition, and that I had been losing it for years without knowing the game was being played. My parents had spent the previous decade discussing, in general terms, the eventual disposition of their assets. They were in their late 60s and in good health, and the conversations were not urgent, more the responsible planning of people who wanted clarity rather than chaos when the time came. The conversations included both Ren and me separately and together, and I'd always believed I had a reasonable picture of their intentions based on those conversations. My parents met with an estate attorney to formalize their documents. This was not a surprise. They had mentioned they were going to do it. What was a surprise was what the finalized documents contained. I learned the contents through my mother, who shared them with both of us on the same occasion, and who had no apparent awareness that what she was sharing would land differently on me than on Ren. The documents reflected a distribution that was meaningfully unequal in Ren's direction. Not dramatically, not a disinheritance, but a gap that had no basis in anything my parents had communicated to me in years of conversation about their intentions. The reasoning offered when I asked my mother directly was a set of characterizations about my financial stability versus Ren's ongoing needs. Characterizations that were partially accurate in their broad strokes, but whose specific texture was unfamiliar to me in ways I couldn't immediately account for. I asked my mother where the specific texture had come from. She was vague in the way of someone who has absorbed a version of events gradually enough that she can no longer identify its source. I asked if she and my father had spoken with Ren specifically about the distribution. There was a pause. That was its own answer. I went home and I thought about every conversation I could remember, having with my parents over the previous several years about my life, my financial situation, my relationship status, my professional circumstances, the ordinary texture of an adult life shared with parents who were paying attention. I thought about which of those conversations Ren had been aware of and how, and what the picture assembled from those pieces would look like to someone receiving them selectively. I called my cousin Addie, who moved in the same social world as Ren, and with whom I had a relationship of sufficient trust to ask direct questions. I asked her whether Ren talked about me. Addie was quiet in the way that precedes honesty, and then told me that Ren talked about me regularly in contexts that included mutual family connections. That the portrait was consistently one of someone who was managing adequately, but whose self-sufficiency was somewhat performed. Who appeared stable, but whose stability was more fragile than I let on. Addie said she had never fully believed the portrait, because it didn't match her direct experience of me, but that she had also never specifically contested it, because contesting it would have required explaining that she was contesting something she'd heard privately from Ren, which would have cost her the friendship. I sat with this for 3 weeks. What I was assembling was not a single dramatic incident, but a pattern, a sustained, years-long project of characterization delivered through the private channels of my parents' relationship with their other daughter, building a portrait of me that made the document's distribution feel reasonable, rather than arbitrary. I had a conversation with Ren that I had not planned to have until I was more prepared, and which I had less time to prepare for than I wanted because Ren called me first. Apparently, Addie had said something, carefully, that had signaled to Ren that I'd been asking questions. The conversation that resulted had the specific quality of a confrontation that both parties have been building toward from different directions for different lengths of time. Ren did not deny the characterizations she'd been making. She reframed them. She said she had been worried about me, that the concerns she'd expressed to our parents were genuine, that she had never intended them to shape their estate planning, and had not known they had. I told her that whether she'd intended them to function as planning input was separate from whether they had, and that a decade of private characterizations delivered to our parents through channels I didn't have access to had produced a document that reflected those characterizations. She said she was sorry, The sorry was delivered in a way that was clearly genuine and clearly insufficient, and both of those things were true at the same time. I spoke to my parents, not to contest the documents. I want to be specific about this because it matters for how I feel about what I did. I spoke to them to make sure they had the complete picture of my circumstances and my character from me directly, rather than assembled from a secondhand portrait I hadn't known was being constructed. I told them specifically and calmly about my actual financial situation, my actual stability. The ways the characterization Ren had apparently been offering didn't match the reality. I told them I wasn't asking them to change anything. I was asking them to know me accurately. My mother cried. My father was quiet for a long time, and then said he wished he'd asked me directly more. He said he thought he had known me, but he understood now that he had been knowing a version of me that came through someone else's account more than he'd realized. The documents were revised. My parents did this without my requesting it, and without telling Ren before they did it. And when Ren found out, she called me, and the conversation was one of the more difficult ones I have had with her, which is saying something given the conversation that preceded it. She said she felt like I had gone to our parents to damage her. I told her I had gone to our parents to give them accurate information about their own child, which was something she had been doing for years in the direction that served her, and which I had simply done once in the direction that was true. We are still in each other's lives. The relationship is different in quality from what it was, not because I am withholding from it, but because I am seeing it clearly for what it is, which is a relationship with someone who, when resources were at stake, used the access she had to my parents to build a picture that served her. I love her because she is my sister, and because there is more to her than that. I also know what she is capable of, and I carry that knowledge forward as information rather than as a wound, which is the only way I've found to keep it from being both. That story is over. The decade-long project of private characterization delivered through channels the other person didn't have access to is the specific and patient form of this kind of family harm. Not a single act, not a dramatic move, just consistent, sustained narrative management in the room you're not in, building a picture that hardens slowly enough that by the time it produces a document with your name on it, the picture has been the furniture of your parents' understanding for so long that nobody can remember when it arrived. The narrator's framing of the conversation with parents as being about accurate information rather than document revision is exactly the right approach and exactly the right distinction. One is about truth, one is about money, and conflating them would have reduced the truth to a transaction. Ren's accusation that going to the parents was an act of damage is the final reframe of someone who has been running an advantage and suddenly isn't. And the response, that providing accurate information about yourself is the same category of act she'd been performing for years, just into the direction that was true, is the cleanest possible answer. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do when you discover a campaign has been run against you and the rooms you weren't in is simply walk into those rooms and let the people in them meet the actual person. Our next story comes from someone who discovered that the family member they'd been protecting had been using that protection as cover for behavior that made the protection itself complicit. My younger brother Samson is 7 years younger than me and has occupied for most of our lives the specific position of the one I looked out for. Not because Samson was weak. He was bright and capable and had a quality of warmth that people responded to immediately, but because our family circumstances during his childhood were more difficult than they'd been during mine, and I had been old enough to buffer some of that difficulty in ways he wasn't able to do for himself. Protecting Samson was something I'd done for so long, it had become less a choice and more a reflex, the way any practiced behavior eventually becomes. By the time we were adults, I was still running the protection reflex. without consistently examining whether it was warranted. Samson was in his mid-30s and functional, and had a life that, from the outside, looked entirely okay, and I was still occasionally absorbing consequences that should have landed on him, occasionally smoothing over situations that would have been better served by friction, occasionally presenting a better version of him to family members who were entitled to a more accurate one. I did this without resenting it and without examining it, because the reflex was too old and too practiced to present itself for examination. What broke the reflex was a specific incident involving my parents and a specific amount of money that I'm going to tell you about as plainly as it happened. Samson had borrowed money from my parents on 3 occasions over a period of 4 years. The amounts were not catastrophic, but they were collectively significant, and they had been borrowed with the assurance of repayment timelines that had not been honored. My parents had not pressed Samson about this because pressing Samson created a conflict that created tension in the family that somehow always resolved with me absorbing the tension management, which my parents had unconsciously come to rely on. The arrangement had self-organized into a system nobody had designed, but everyone was running. My parents mentioned the outstanding balance to me, not as a complaint, more as a worry. In the way they mentioned worries they didn't know how to address directly. The amount was just over $9,000. I did what my reflex had always done. I told them I would talk to Samson. I would help figure it out. I would manage the situation and get back to them. I called Samson. The conversation I had expected to have was a gentle and somewhat awkward negotiation about repayment logistics. The conversation I actually had was different because Samson said something early in it that restructured the entire frame. He said, before I got to the repayment discussion, that he'd been meaning to talk to me about what our parents had said to him recently because he felt they'd been pressuring him in a way that wasn't fair given his circumstances. I asked what they'd said. He described a conversation with our parents about the money that bore enough resemblance to a real conversation to be credible, but that characterized their tone and approach in a way I strongly doubted, given what I knew of how my parents actually communicated about difficult things. He described our mother as harsh and our father as dismissive, which corresponded to nothing in my 30 years of watching both of them manage conflict. I asked him some specific questions about the conversation. The details became slightly less consistent as I asked more of them. Not dramatically, Samson is not a careless person, but enough that I was aware of watching someone manage the narrative of a situation in real time rather than simply reporting it. I called my mother after I got off the phone with Samson. I asked her to walk me through the conversation she'd had with him about the money. Her account was substantially different from his. Not slightly different, not a matter of interpretation, but different in the specific ways that matter when you're trying to understand whether one person is characterizing an event accurately or constructing a version of it that serves a purpose. My mother had not been harsh. My father had not been dismissive. They had asked, with evident discomfort, whether Samson had any sense of a timeline, and he had said he was working on it, and the conversation had ended. I sat with the gap between those two accounts, and I understood something I had been insulated from understanding by the protection reflex. Samson managed situations the way he managed situations by ensuring that the people most likely to hold him accountable received a version of events that made accountability seem unreasonable. I had been one of the people most likely to hold him accountable. I had been receiving modified versions of events for years and running interference on his behalf, based on those modified versions without ever comparing them to what the other parties actually experienced. I did not call Samson back with the conversation I'd originally planned to have. I called him back with a different one. I told him I had spoken to our mother, and I knew the conversation with our parents had not been as he described it to me, and that I needed him to understand that I was no longer going to manage situations involving him based on accounts he provided without checking them against the other parties involved. I told him I loved him, and I was not going to disappear from his life but I was going to stop being someone whose protection he could rely on when the protection required me to run on inaccurate information. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said that wasn't fair. I asked him to be specific about what wasn't fair. He said I was taking our parents' side. I said I wasn't taking sides, I was correcting my information, which was a different thing. He said it didn't feel different. I said I understood that, and it was still what I was doing. The repayment conversation happened eventually. A structured timeline, modest monthly amounts, an arrangement my parents accepted because it was something rather than nothing, and because the conversation that produced it had finally happened without me in the middle, translating it to something easier than it was. I was not in the middle of it. I told both parties I was available if they wanted to talk to me about it, but I was not going to manage the conversation between them, and I didn't. Samson and I are still in each other's lives. Something has changed that I don't have a simple word for. Not the love, which is intact, but the specific quality of ease that the protection had always generated, which is no longer available because the protection is no longer being offered in its old form. It is strange to lose an ease you didn't know you'd paid for. It is also, I have found on most days, a relief that story is over. The specific mechanism of Samson's management is the thing that makes this story so precisely recognizable. Not fabrication exactly, but the selective characterization of other parties that makes the person receiving the account feel that intervention is warranted, rather than that accountability is. The narrator has been the intervention mechanism for years, without knowing they were being deployed, and the specific moment of understanding comes from the small inconsistencies in a story told under light questioning, which is always how constructed accounts begin to show their seams. In the decision to stop managing the conversation between his parents and Samson, to be available, but not to be in the middle, is the right structural change. The one that removes the incentive at the source rather than the behavior at the surface. The loss of ease that the protection had generated is named with the specific honesty of someone who knows they've given up something real in the service of something more important, and who is still in the process of deciding whether the trade was worth it. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone you've been protecting is stop and let the consequences of their own choices land where they were always supposed to land, and trust that the landing teaches something that the protection never could. Our next story comes from someone who discovered that a family secret they'd been kept out of had been shaping every significant decision their family made for decades, and that the keeping of it had required the sustained effort of everyone they were closest to. I am adopted. I have always known this. My parents told me early and consistently, in the way that adoption experts recommend, as a simple fact of origin that was part of my story, without being the whole of it. I felt no particular wound around this knowledge. My parents were my parents in every sense that the word actually means, and I had never experienced the adoption as a gap in my identity that needed filling. What I did not know until I was 42 was that I had a biological sibling, a full sibling, same mother, same father, born 2 years before me and placed with a different family and living. I would discover, 4 states away, and entirely unaware that I existed. I found this out through a consumer DNA test that I took on a casual impulse at the suggestion of a friend who had found some interesting ancestral information through the same service. I was not looking for biological family. I was mildly curious about geographic heritage, and I thought the process sounded interesting. The test returned what it always returns for adoptees who take it without preparation: more information than they were ready for, delivered without context or ceremony. The match showed a full sibling relationship with a confidence level that left no statistical ambiguity. His name in the platform was a partial display, a first name, not an initial, and he had also uploaded his data without apparently expecting to find what I represented to his results. I did not contact him immediately. I contacted my parents first because I was not willing to have a conversation with a biological stranger before I had a conversation with the people who had known this and had not told me. My mother's response to the name I showed her was not surprise. It was the response of someone receiving information they already have. She sat with it for a moment, and then she said that she had known. My father, when he came into the room, had the same quality. Not surprise, but the specific relief and dread combined of someone who has been waiting for a thing to arrive and has finally heard it knock. They had known since before they adopted me. Now, the adoption agency had disclosed the existence of a sibling placed separately. A disclosure that was not standard practice at the time, but that the specific agency had offered as part of their process. My parents had decided not to tell me, not from malice. They had made the decision with the genuine belief that the information might complicate my sense of my own family and my own belonging, and that the decision about whether to seek out biological connections was one they wanted to wait until I was older to offer me. The waiting had extended, year by year, past the moment that would have felt natural to introduce the information, until the information had been waiting so long that introducing it felt impossible, and then impossible had become the permanent state. They had also, I subsequently learned, Amy told my mother's sister, my Aunt Frances, who had known for 15 years and had never said anything to me, and my older cousin Jerome, who had found out through Frances and had carried it for 8 years. There were 4 people in my immediate family world who had known this specific thing about my own biological history and had maintained the silence because the original decision had been made, and reversing, it was something nobody knew how to initiate. I want to be honest about the specific quality of what I felt, because I think it deserves accuracy. It was not primarily anger, not at first. It was the vertigo of understanding that a significant fact about my own origin had been a managed secret for my entire life, and that the management had required the consistent effort of multiple people who were present in my daily life, and who had looked at me across tables and at gatherings for decades while carrying something I was not carrying. There is a specific loneliness in that realization that is hard to name, and I am trying to name it accurately. It is the loneliness of understanding that there was a room in the people closest to you that had your name on it and that you were never allowed inside. My parents and I had several conversations over the following weeks. They were honest in them in a way that I believe they had not been able to be when the secret was intact, fully without the management of what to disclose and what to protect. Just the plain account of how the decision was made and how the years of it had accumulated. My father said he had thought about telling me many times and had never been able to locate the right moment and had eventually stopped looking for it, which is the most honest accounting of how these silences calcify that I have ever heard from inside one. I am not estranged from my parents. I want to be clear about that because I think the clarity matters. They made a decision that was wrong and that had a real cost, and that they made with genuine care for me as their child, which is a complicated combination that I have had to hold without resolving it into something simpler. The love is real. The harm is real. Both things are true, and I carry both. I contacted my biological brother. His name is Gabriel, and he had also not known about me, he had taken the DNA test 6 months earlier as a gift from his wife, and had seen my partial match in his results, and had been deciding how to respond for all of those 6 months. We spoke for the first time on a Thursday afternoon for 2 hours. We have spoken many times since. He is a person I would probably like if I had met him without the biological context, and the biological context makes him something more than that, something I don't have a fully settled word for yet. We are building something carefully, at a pace that respects what it is and what it isn't, and I find most days that the building itself is the thing that matters. My parents have met Gabriel, but the meeting happened at my initiation, and with Gabriel's consent, and it was one of the more emotionally complex occasions I have sat through. My parents meeting the existence of what their decision had kept from me, rendered visible in the form of a person I now knew. My mother cried. My father shook Gabriel's hand and held it for a moment longer than a handshake requires, and I understood what was in that extra moment without needing it explained. The secret is over. The room that had my name on it has been opened, and I've been inside it, and I know now what it contained. What I have done with the knowing is try to build from it rather than be defined by it, which is the only option available, and which I have found, on most days, to be enough. That story is over. The loneliness of understanding that there was a room in the people closest to you that had your name on it, and that you were never allowed inside, is the most precise description of what this specific category of family secret produces. Not a betrayal of action, but a betrayal of sustained omission, which is in some ways harder to process because it doesn't have a single moment you can point to as the thing that happened. The father's accounting of how he thought about telling and never found the right moment and eventually stopped looking is the most honest sentence in the story because it describes the mechanism of permanent deferral without dressing it as anything other than what it is. Gabriel waiting 6 months with the match and his results before deciding how to respond is its own quiet parallel. Two people sitting separately with the same information, not knowing the other is sitting with it too, both deciding carefully how to move towards something they weren't prepared to find. The meeting where the father holds the handshake a moment longer than necessary is the image that carries the most weight because it contains everything: the acknowledgement, the grief, the thing that can't be said in a room full of people, but that the extra second of held contact communicates anyway. Sometimes the most important family you find is the one you weren't supposed to know you had. And sometimes the people who kept you from knowing them were trying, imperfectly and at significant cost to you, to love you. Both things can be true, and you can carry both without letting either become the only story. Our next story comes from someone who spent years believing they were the problem in a family dynamic, only to discover that the dynamic had been engineered by a family member who needed a problem in order to remain the solution. I grew up in a household where my mother and her mother, my grandmother Lois, had a relationship that functioned as the family's emotional weather system. When they were aligned, the household was warm and stable. When they were in conflict, everything in the surrounding environment absorbed the friction without anyone acknowledging that the friction was happening. I was the youngest of 3, and by the time I was old enough to understand the dynamic, I'd already learned to read its atmospheric pressure the way people who grow up near water learn to read the sky. My grandmother Lois lived with us for most of my childhood. She had her own room and her own routines, and was present at the table, and at the television, and in the ordinary flow of daily life, in the way that intergenerational households produce when they function. She was warm to me specifically in the way of someone who has decided you are their particular person, and I loved her with the specific, uncomplicated love of a child who is loved without condition. The relationship between my grandmother and my mother was a different texture entirely. My mother had a quality of tension around Lois that she managed well in front of us, but that seeped into the household's atmosphere in ways I learned to navigate early. Arguments were rare, and when they happened in lowered voices behind closed doors. What was more common was a quality of strain. The specific strain of 2 women who had been negotiating the same territory for decades, and who had developed, through that negotiation, a set of positions that were more structural than situational. I became, without anyone deciding this explicitly, the household's emotional translator between them. When my grandmother was hurt by something my mother had said or done, I was the one she told. When my mother was frustrated by something my grandmother had done, I was the one she processed it with. Nicole, I was 9 years old when this started, and I was 31 when I finally understood what it had cost. The understanding came from an unlikely source, which was my grandmother herself, who at 84 had developed the specific freedom of someone who no longer has enough time to spend any of it managing other people's comfort. She called me one afternoon and said she needed to tell me something she should have told me years ago, and I heard in her voice the specific quality of someone who has made a decision and is calling before they change their mind. She told me that for most of my childhood, she had been deliberately involving me in her conflicts with my mother. Not in dramatic ways, not weaponizing me, not asking me to take sides explicitly, but by consistently choosing to process her grievances with me, rather than with her own peers or her other grandchildren, and by doing so in ways that she now understood had loaded me with emotional weight I had been too young to consent to carrying. She said she had told herself it was different from burdening a child, because I was perceptive and because I listened well, and because the conversations always felt more like genuine exchange than like dumping. She said she understood now that those justifications had served her rather than me. She said she was sorry. She said the sorry specifically, not I'm sorry if I was too much or I'm sorry if it was hard, but I'm sorry for what I did, in the direct form that apologies take when they've been examined rather than offered as social management. And I sat with what she told me for several days. What I was examining was not primarily the grandmother relationship. The apology had settled something there that I was grateful for. What I was examining was the thing that the relationship had produced in me, which was a fluency in emotional translation that I had carried into every relationship I'd been in since. A reflexive availability for other people's emotional processing that preceded consent. A habit of being the person in the room who absorbs rather than the person who speaks. I had therapized these things as personality traits and worked on them as personal development projects without having the full picture of where they'd come from. My grandmother gave me the full picture. It didn't rewrite everything. I am who I am, and some of what I am would have developed regardless of what she'd asked of me at 9. But it changed the weight I assigned to certain habits by explaining where they'd been learned, which changed how I worked on them. Knowing the origin of a pattern is not the same as excusing it, but it does change what you're actually working on when you try to shift it. My mother and I had a conversation about it that was its own complicated territory. She had not known explicitly what my grandmother had been doing, not as a deliberate strategy, not as something Lois had consciously designed. But when I described the pattern, she recognized it in a way that suggested she had observed something similar without naming it. She said she wished she had paid more attention to what her children were being asked to carry on her behalf. She said it in a way that applied to more than just my grandmother's dynamic with me. My grandmother is 86 now. We talk twice a week, and the conversations have a different quality than that they've ever had. Lighter, more mutual. The specific ease of two people who know each other fully and have said the difficult thing and found themselves still standing afterward. She is funny in ways I'd always known, and honest in ways I'm still getting used to, and I find that I love her with a different quality than I did before. Not less, but more complete. The way loving someone is always more complete when you see them as a person, rather than as the role they occupied in your childhood. That story is over. The grandmother making the call before she changes her mind is the detail that gives this one its specific emotional texture. That combination of freedom and urgency that the end of a long life sometimes produces, the willingness to say the difficult thing that the earlier decades kept managed. The apology in its direct form, not hedged, not conditional, just the plain acknowledgement of the specific thing, is the apology that actually lands and does actual work, rather than the kind designed to make the giver feel better. The reframe of the translator habit as something learned rather than intrinsic is the most practically useful thing in the story, because it changes what you're working on. You're not trying to overcome a personality trait that has always been yours. You're trying to unlearn a response to a demand made on you before you were old enough to evaluate it. Sometimes the most healing thing a person who hurt you can do is tell you the truth about it clearly enough that The truth itself does some of the repair work, and sometimes the repair is more complete than you expected, because the truth turns out to explain more than just the thing you were examining. Our next story comes from someone who discovered that the family member who had always been held up as the model of responsibility had maintained that model by ensuring that the comparison never ran in the other direction. My older brother, Callum, was the family standard for 12 years before I was born, and for the entire stretch of my childhood and adolescence. Not in a way that was cruel or deliberately wielded as a weapon, more in the ambient way of a standard that has been in the environment long enough to become the air, rather than a thing in the air. Callum got good grades. Callum was reliable. Callum managed his money carefully. Callum was the kind of person who handled things rather than having things happen to him. These qualities were real, and I want to be clear about that. He was those things, or he was those things in the ways that were visible. I spent my childhood in the specific interior weather of someone who is not the good one, not the bad one either. I was not a troubled child or a failing student, or someone whose behavior required management. I was simply less extraordinary than the person I was implicitly compared to, which in a family that has decided what excellence looks like is its own form of difficulty. I developed a habit of underselling myself that I carried into my adult life and worked to overcome in my 30s, and which had a source I thought I understood. The source I thought I understood was the standard itself, the ambient presence of Callum's achievements as the family's unit of measurement. What I did not understand was that the standard had been actively maintained. I found this out when I was 37 and Callum was 49, and we were at a family gathering at which our parents were present, and at which a conversation happened that was not planned, and which produced something that could not be unproduced. We were talking about early career experiences, the ordinary retrospective conversation that happens when people who have known each other across decades get enough distance from the early years to talk about them without the defensiveness of proximity. Callum mentioned a period in his late 20s that I had no memory of as having been difficult, a business venture that had failed, a period of financial stress, a year during which things had been genuinely hard. He mentioned it as context for something else, briefly, without apparent awareness that what he was saying did not match the story I had been living with. I asked him to tell me more about it. He did, in the easy way of someone recounting history that is fully integrated and no longer tender. And the failure had been significant. He had lost a substantial amount of money and had needed to restructure his professional life almost completely. He had been in his late 20s during this period and had been embarrassed by it and had kept it quiet. Quiet in our family meant our parents did not know. Or rather, I asked my mother later if she had known about this period, and she had not. Not the specifics, not the scale of it. What our family had known about Callum's late 20s was a carefully managed version, a period of professional transition, some changes in direction, the ordinary navigation of a dynamic field, the failure, the financial stress, the restructuring. These had been absorbed into a presentable narrative and delivered to the family as something considerably less dramatic. The family's understanding of the two of us in our late 20s, which had informed how our parents talked about us and thought about us and held us in their assessment of their children, had been built from two different information sets. Mine had been fully visible. I had been going through my own professional uncertainties during that period, and had been open about them in the way I'd always been open with my family, because I didn't know not to be. Callum's had been managed to present a version that maintained the standard, while the actual experience was considerably more textured. I am not angry at Callum about this in a simple way. The instinct to manage the story of your own failures is human, and I understand it. What I am more specifically aware of is the effect of the asymmetry. That my family's comparative perception of us during a decade of our adult lives had been shaped by an information gap that I had not known existed and that had not been corrected, because correcting it would have required Callum to disclose something he had decided not to disclose. I talked to Callum about it directly, not to make him feel guilty for managing his own story. Everyone has the right to decide what they share about their difficult periods, but to make him aware that the management had produced a comparison that had affected me and that had been running on incomplete information, and that I thought he should know that. He was quiet for a long time and then said he hadn't thought about it from my perspective. He said he'd been so focused on managing how he was perceived that he hadn't considered how the perception of him affected the perception of me by the people who held both pictures. I believe he was telling the truth about not having considered it. I believe he considered it fully in the weeks after that conversation. Our parents don't know the full version, and I have decided not to provide it. What I have provided in the years since is a more complete version of my own. The specific accomplishments and recoveries and acts of persistence that my habit of underselling had kept from being visible. I have given my parents a fuller picture of their younger child, not by diminishing the older one, but by refusing to continue offering a partial version of myself that the ambient standard had made feel appropriate. The underselling habit is better than it was. Understanding where it came from has helped in the specific way that accurate origin stories always help. Not as an excuse to keep the pattern, but as an explanation of what the pattern was responding to, which changes what you need to do to address it. I am still working on it. Most days that feels like enough. That story is over. The information asymmetry between two siblings during the same decade of their adult lives, one fully visible, one carefully managed, is the specific mechanism that made the standard unfair, without anyone intending unfairness as an outcome. Callum's instinct to manage his own failure is human, and the narrator gives it that credit, which is the right approach. This is not a story about a villain, but about a structural inequality that produced real harm without requiring malicious intent at its center. The moment at the family gathering where what Callum says doesn't match the story the narrator has been living with is the exact texture of how these things surface. Not a confession, not an investigation, just a casual retrospective remark that drops differently than intended because the listener has been living with a version that couldn't absorb it. The decision to address the comparison, not by diminishing Callum, but by giving the parents a fuller picture of the other child, is exactly the right structural response. You correct the asymmetry at the source, rather than trying to redistribute the damage. And sometimes the most important act of self-advocacy is simply deciding to be fully visible to the people whose perception of you has been shaped by a picture you kept smaller than it needed to be. Our next story comes from someone who believed that they had built a genuine alliance with a family member during a difficult period, and discovered that the alliance had been entirely transactional from one direction and was over the moment the transaction concluded. My parents' health declined in the same 2-year period, which is the kind of compounded difficulty that people warn you is possible, but that has a specific quality when it happens that the warning doesn't fully prepare you for. My father had a cardiac event that required significant recovery. My mother was diagnosed with an autoimmune condition that needed ongoing management. Both things happened within 14 months of each other. And for those 14 months and for the year following, I was managing both situations simultaneously, while also managing my own life and professional responsibilities. I have 2 siblings. My sister Camille lives overseas. She had moved internationally for a marriage that had since ended, but had rebuilt her life there, and returning was not straightforward. My brother Warren lives 40 minutes from my parents, as I do, and had the same geographic proximity and the same theoretical availability. The distinction in practice was that I showed up, and Warren did not, or did not in the proportionate way that the situation warranted. Warren had reasons. He always had reasons, and the reasons were always partially legitimate in the way that reasons are when someone has decided in advance that they need them. His work was demanding. His own children were young. He was dealing with things he didn't always specify, but that he implied were significant. I accepted the reasons because accepting them was less costly than confronting them. During a period when I didn't have the resources for a confrontation, and because my parents needed care, and the care needed to happen, regardless of whether Warren was contributing to it. What Warren did contribute during this period was emotional presence and conversations with me. He called regularly and listened to what I was dealing with, and said the right things, and expressed what seemed like genuine gratitude for what I was doing and genuine guilt about his own limitations. He told me multiple times that he didn't know how I was managing it, and that he owed me, and that he was going to be there for me in the way I'd been there for our parents when things settled down. He said this specifically and repeatedly, and I believed him because I needed to believe something, and this was the available thing. My parents stabilized, my father recovered to a functional level. My mother's condition became managed rather than acute. The period of crisis concluded over the course of about 4 months, and then we were on the other side of it, and the landscape settled into something that resembled ordinary life again. But Warren's presence in my life reduced within 6 weeks of the stabilization. Not dramatically, not a sudden withdrawal, just a gradual receding of contact, back to the level it had been before the crisis, which was occasional and friendly, and without particular depth. The calls became less frequent. The conversations became lighter. The expressions of gratitude and owing stopped appearing. Because gratitude expressed after the fact of a crisis has a shorter half-life than the crisis that produced it. I waited 3 months to see if the pattern would reverse. It did not. I called Warren and I told him what I had observed and what I was feeling about it, which was specific and honest, and which I had spent some time preparing so that it was neither accusatory beyond the evidence nor softer than the truth warranted. I told him I had done something significant for the family during a difficult period, and that during that period, he had made specific statements about reciprocity that I had taken seriously, and that the 6 weeks since the stabilization had not suggested those statements were going to be honored. Warren received this with the quality of a person hearing something they knew was coming and had hoped would not arrive. He said he heard me. He said he was sorry. He said he had meant what he said during the crisis period, and that the stabilization had produced a relaxation in him that he hadn't fully examined. He said he would do better. The doing better lasted approximately 3 weeks, not a complete return to the crisis period. Attentiveness that would have been disproportionate to the post-crisis context, but a genuine effort that was visible and that produced something I could work with. Then the 3 weeks concluded, and the effort concluded with it, and we were back to occasional and friendly and without depth. I had a second conversation, this one shorter, less prepared, with less patience in it. I told Warren that I had watched him make an effort for 3 weeks and then stop, and that I had understood from the stopping that the effort was a response to my previous conversation, rather than a genuine shift. I told him I wasn't going to have a third conversation because the third conversation would be a repetition of the first two, and I didn't have the energy for a repetition. I told him I loved him and I wasn't going anywhere, but I was going to stop expecting something from him that he had shown me he was not able to give. He did not argue with this assessment. He said he understood. The quality of his response, quiet, without defense, almost relieved, told me he'd known for longer than I had that this was the accurate description of his capacity. Our relationship is what it is now, occasional and friendly and without depth, which is what it was before the crisis and what it apparently was always going to return to. I am at peace with it in the way you make peace with a disappointing but stable truth about a person you're going to continue to have in your life. The specific grief of it is the loss of what he said during the crisis period, which I had wanted to be true and which had given me something to hold on to during a year that required holding on to things. the wanting it to be true doesn't make it true, and the fact that it wasn't is its own information about him that I carry forward as calibration. My parents' care is ongoing, and I manage it with the help of hired support that the family contributes to financially, which Warren does without hesitation, which is something, and which I count as something, without pretending it is the same thing as presence. They are doing well enough. I am doing well enough. The year is behind us, and most of what it revealed is simply the shape of things as they actually are, which is always worth knowing, even when knowing costs something. That story is over. The half-life of crisis period gratitude is the exact mechanism named here. The sincerity was real during the crisis, because the crisis made sincerity feel achievable. And then the crisis ended, and the ordinary conditions of how Warren operated reasserted themselves. And the sincerity couldn't survive the reassertion. The 3 weeks of effort that concluded when it became clear no further conversation was imminent is the specific behavior of someone responding to social pressure rather than internal change. And the narrator identifies it correctly without being cruel about it. This is not Warren being malicious. It's Warren being limited in a specific way that his own behavior reveals over time. The decision not to have a third conversation is exactly the right call. Not a withdrawal, not a rupture, just the refusal to perform a script that has already shown its ending twice. Sometimes the most accurate thing you can do with someone who showed you their limits is simply believe the limits and stop expecting the territory past them, which is not giving up on the person, but giving up on the version of them that the crisis briefly made available. Our next story comes from someone who discovered that a family member's long history of generosity had been building toward a moment of control they had never been told to expect. My father's older sister, my Aunt Greta, was the family's benefactor for as long as I could remember. She had done well financially in a way that the rest of the family had not, and she expressed that success through generosity that was genuine and consistent, birthday gifts that were thoughtful and significantly above what anyone else in the family could afford, contributions to family expenses at holiday gatherings, a habit of showing up with exactly the thing someone needed before they'd fully articulated needing it. She was loved for this in the specific way that genuinely generous people are loved, which is with a gratitude that has warmth in it, rather than just obligation. I was the recipient of her generosity at specific significant moments. She contributed to my college education when my parents' resources weren't sufficient. She gave me a sum of money when I was starting out professionally that let me take a job that mattered to my career, rather than one that only paid the bills. These were not small things, and I expressed my gratitude for them genuinely and consistently, and believed them to be unconditional in the way that gifts between people who love each other are supposed to be unconditional. I was 34 when Greta called me with something she wanted to discuss. She was 71 and in good health, and the call had a quality of deliberateness that I registered but didn't fully read before we were already into the conversation. She told me she had been thinking about the future, her future specifically, and about the years to come when her needs might be more significant than they currently were. She said she had been thinking about the family and about the relationships she'd invested in over the decades. She used the word invested. I registered it and kept listening. She told me she had some expectations, not demands. She was careful about the word, used invested and expectations rather than anything harder. But she wanted me to understand that the generosity she had extended to me over the years had been extended with the understanding that it was building something mutual, and that the mutuality would express itself when the time came. She said she hoped I understood this had always been the implicit framework, and that making it explicit now was just ensuring we were on the same page. I did not say what I thought in that moment because what I thought would have ended the conversation before I had gathered enough information. I asked her to tell me more about what she was describing practically, that she was specific. She wanted to know that when her health declined, she would have family present and available in ways that went beyond occasional visits. She wanted to know that financial support would be available if her own resources proved insufficient. She wanted to feel, she said, that her investments in the family had produced a network of people who understood what she'd given and what they owed in return. I ended the call politely, and I sat at my kitchen table for a long time afterward. The college contribution, the professional start, the birthday gifts across 3 decades. I went through each of them in my memory, and I looked for the version of those moments in which the giving had felt conditional. I could not find that version, not because it hadn't existed, but because the conditionality had been invisible, which is the specific design of a gift given with implicit terms rather than stated ones. You cannot consent to a transaction whose terms are not disclosed at the time of the transaction. You can only discover, when the terms are eventually presented, that a transaction is what it was. I called my father. I told him about the conversation and asked him whether he had any knowledge of Greta operating this way with other family members. His silence before answering was long enough to be informative. He said he was aware that Greta thought of her generosity in relational terms. I asked him to be more specific. He said he had received a version of a similar conversation 8 years earlier and had not told me because he hadn't thought it was his information to share. There were 3 other family members who had received versions of this conversation. I found this out over the following weeks through individual conversations that each began with me asking directly, and each produced the specific discomfort of people who had been sitting with something they hadn't known what to do with. The generosity had been extended consistently, and the terms had been presented later, privately, to each recipient. A structure that ensured nobody compared notes and nobody understood the full scope of what was being built until they were already inside it. I called Greta back. I told her I had thought carefully about what she'd said and that I wanted to respond honestly. I told her I was grateful for the specific things she had given me and that I named them specifically. The education, the professional support, the years of birthday gifts, and that the gratitude was genuine and would remain genuine regardless of what I was about to say. Then I told her that I had not understood those gifts to be conditional at the time they were given, and that I was not in a position to retroactively accept terms. I had not been offered the opportunity to evaluate when the gifts were made. I told her I was not going to treat her badly in her old age. I would be a nephew. I would visit. I would be present in the ways that family is present. But I was not going to do those things as the honoring of an undisclosed debt. I was going to do them, or not do them, on the basis of who she was to me and who I chose to be to her. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said she hadn't thought I would respond that way. I told her I understood that and that I hoped we could continue to have a relationship without the framework she'd described, because the relationship was real to me and I didn't want to lose it to an accounting I hadn't agreed to participate in. The relationship has continued. It is different in a way that sits between us without being fully named. She knows that I know, and I know that she knows. And we have both decided, I think, that the relationship is worth more than the argument about its terms. The generosity has continued in smaller form, and I receive it as what it is now, which is both a genuine expression of care and an expression from a person whose care has always been partly a transaction, and both of those things are true, and I hold them together as the complete picture of who she is. My father and I talked about the 8 years he'd known and not told me. That conversation was its own thing and produced its own reckoning, smaller than what Greta's call had produced, but real. He said he should have told me, and he was right, and I told him so. And we moved through it and came out the other side of it, closer than we'd been before, which is the specific, unexpected good outcome that honest, difficult conversations sometimes produce when both people are willing to stay in them. That story is over. The design of the invisible conditionality is the mechanism that makes this particular form of generosity so specifically difficult to reckon with. You cannot evaluate a transaction whose terms are hidden, and the hiding ensures that by the time the terms arrive, the gifts have already done their work, and the gratitude is already real, and the retroactive application of conditions has something genuine to leverage against. The word invested is the tell in the conversation, and the narrator identifies it correctly in the moment and keeps listening, which is the right move. You gather the full picture before you respond, rather than reacting to the word before you understand the framework around it. The response to gratitude for the specific things named specifically, then refusal of the retroactive framework, is exactly calibrated, neither dismissing the gifts nor accepting terms she wasn't offered at the time of receiving them. The Father's 8 years of knowing is its own smaller reckoning handled cleanly, and producing closeness rather than rupture, which is the outcome of an honest conversation between two people who are both willing to own their part. Sometimes the most important boundary you can draw in a family relationship is the one between genuine care and undisclosed transaction, and drawing it doesn't have to destroy what the care was real in. It just means you receive the care clearly, rather than inside a contract you didn't sign. Our next story comes from someone who spent years believing a family member's distance was personality, and discovered it was strategy, deployed specifically to avoid accountability for something that had been running quietly for a very long time. My father's sister, my Aunt Lorraine, was the family member nobody could quite get close to. Not cold exactly. She showed up at gatherings. She sent cards on birthdays. She asked the appropriate questions about your life and listened to the answers with what appeared to be genuine interest. But there was always a quality of managed distance in her presence, a way of being in a room without being fully available in it, that the family had long since filed under personality and stopped examining. Some people are private. Lorraine was private. That was simply who she was. I had accepted this framing for my entire adult life and had no particular reason to revisit it until my grandmother's estate was being settled and an accounting irregularity surfaced that required examination of the family's financial history, in more detail than anyone had previously attempted. My grandmother had managed her own finances with the help of a family member for the last 11 years of her life. That family member was Lorraine, who had positioned herself as the natural choice. She was organized, she was available. She was the child who lived closest to my grandmother and who had the most flexible schedule. The family had been grateful and had expressed that gratitude without looking closely at what the management entailed. The accounting irregularity was identified by the estate attorney during probate. It was not catastrophic in scale, but it was specific, and it was documented, and it pointed in a single direction. Over 11 years, a series of transactions had moved money from my grandmother's accounts in amounts and at intervals that had been calibrated to stay beneath the reporting thresholds that would have triggered automatic review. The transactions had accelerated in the final 2 years of my grandmother's life, during the period when her cognitive clarity had begun to soften. The estate attorney presented this to the family at a meeting that Lorraine attended. I watched Lorraine's face when the attorney began describing the transaction pattern, and I understood the managed distance I had been reading as personality my entire life. It was not personality, it was practice. The quality of stillness she maintained while the attorney spoke was the stillness of someone who has been prepared for a moment for a very long time and has arrived at it already arranged. She did not deny the transactions. She said she had managed my grandmother's finances as my grandmother had instructed, that my grandmother had been aware of every movement, that what appeared irregular was simply the expression of my grandmother's own wishes during the final years of her life. She said this calmly and with the specific composure of someone who had constructed an explanation and tested it against every anticipated question. The estate attorney noted that the explanation could not be verified, given that my grandmother was no longer alive to confirm it. He noted that the legal options available to the estate were specific and time-limited. He outlined what pursuing them would require and what it might produce. The The family had a separate conversation without Lorraine present, and the conversation was the most difficult collective decision I've participated in. Not because the right direction was unclear, but because the cost of the right direction was real and distributed across people who hadn't asked to bear it. Pursuing the matter legally would take years and would produce a family public record that nobody had chosen, and would require a sustained confrontation with someone who had already demonstrated a capacity for composure under pressure that suggested she would not make it easy. The family decided to pursue it. I want to say that plainly because it would have been easier not to, and the decision to do the harder thing deserves to be named as the decision it was. The legal process took 14 months. Lorraine maintained her explanation throughout with a consistency that I found both impressive and deeply dispiriting. The story she had prepared was good, it was internally coherent, and it required an absence of evidence rather than the presence of contradictory evidence to survive. What ultimately worked against her was not a piece of evidence that broke the story, but the accumulation of the transaction pattern itself, which expert financial testimony characterized as consistent with deliberate systematic extraction and inconsistent with the management of someone else's organic financial decisions over 11 years. The settlement was not full restitution. These things rarely are. It was enough to constitute an acknowledgement of what the estate had lost and who had taken it, which was the minimum the family had agreed they needed before they would stop. Lorraine has not attended a family gathering since the settlement. She has not been excluded. The family made no formal decision to exclude her, and I believe, if she appeared, she would be received with the cold civility that is the appropriate register for someone who did what she did and was held accountable for it and continues to be family. She has chosen not to appear, which is its own accounting of what she knows. My grandmother's money is gone. The portion that was recovered is into the estate and will be distributed accordingly. What cannot be recovered is the 11 years, the decade plus of my grandmother's financial life, managed in service of someone else's extraction rather than her own interests. During the years when she trusted the person she trusted most with the thing that represented a lifetime of careful living. That cannot be recovered, and I don't have a clean way to hold it. I hold it as it is, without resolution, which is sometimes the only honest option available. That story is over. The managed distance being practice rather than personality is the reframe that gives this whole story its shape. 11 years of strategic positioning that the family read as character rather than cover, which is the specific genius of someone who understood that seeming private protects you from scrutiny in a way that seeming closed off never could. The composure during the attorney's presentation is the detail that tells you how long the preparation had been running. That is not the stillness of someone surprised. It is the stillness of someone who arrived at the moment already arranged. The family's decision to pursue it despite the cost is the moral center of the story. The collective choice that the right thing and the hard thing were the same thing, and that the hardness didn't change what was right. Sometimes the most important thing a family can do in the face of a betrayal, designed to be difficult to confront, is simply confront it anyway, at full cost, and let the confrontation be the thing that says what the family values and what they refuse to absorb quietly in order to preserve a peace that was purchased with someone else's money. Our final story for tonight comes from someone who spent most of their life believing they understood their family completely. And discovered in a single afternoon that the story they'd been living inside had been written by someone else and had never been entirely theirs. I am the oldest of 3. My brother Nate is 4 years younger, and my sister Becca is 7 years younger, and we grew up in a household that was functional and warm, and that I would have described, without hesitation, as honest. My parents talked to us directly. Conflicts were addressed rather than suppressed. The family's culture was one that I held up throughout my adult life as the thing I wanted to replicate. The deliberate honesty that made it feel safe to be known fully by the people who were supposed to know you. I was 41 when my mother called me on a Tuesday afternoon and said she needed to tell me something that she had been carrying for a very long time, and that she needed to tell me before she no longer had the time to do it herself. She is not ill, I want to say that clearly, but she had turned 70, and something about the turning had made the carrying feel different than it had before. She told me that my father, who had passed away 6 years earlier, had had a child before he met her, a son, born when my father was 22 and given up for adoption at the mother's decision, in a period and a place where the decision was not unusual, and the father had very little legal standing to contest it. My father had told my mother about this child before they married. They had made a decision together, in good faith. My mother was clear about this, in the genuine belief that it was the right decision, not to tell us. And the reasoning had been that the adoption was closed, and the likelihood of contact was low, and the information would complicate our understanding of our father in ways that might cost more than they produced. My father had thought about his first son every year on the son's birthday. My mother knew this because he had told her, and because there had been a day in April every year for their entire marriage, when my father was quieter than usual, and she had understood why. She had held this for 43 years of marriage and for 6 years of widowhood. And she was telling me now because she had read something about adult adoptee DNA searches and had understood, finally, that the closed adoption her husband had lived with might not stay closed, and that if it opened, she wanted me to have the context from her, rather than from a stranger. So I sat with what my mother told me for the rest of that afternoon and into the evening. What I was sitting with was not primarily grief about my father. The grief of his loss was 6 years integrated, and this was adjacent to it rather than reopening it. What I was sitting with was the specific experience of learning that the family I had held up as the model of honesty had contained a significant withheld truth for my entire life, and that the truth had been withheld with genuine care and genuine good intentions, and that none of that changed the fact that it had been withheld. I talked to Nate and Becca. Nate was quiet in the way he is when something is large, and he needs time to find the edges of it. Becca cried and then asked the same questions I had asked, and then said, eventually, and that she understood why our parents had made the choice they'd made, even though she wished they'd made a different one. I felt both of those responses and couldn't fully separate them. I thought about my father, specifically and at length. The April quietness that I now understood. The way he sometimes looked at children who were strangers to him, with an expression I had never had a name for, and now did. The small, unremarkable moments of a life that looked complete from the outside and contained quietly something that had never been resolved. He had carried it for his entire adult life without it making him bitter or contracted or less present to the family he had built. I find that remarkable, and I want to say so because I think it deserves to be said. We have not found the first son. My mother reached out through the agency that had handled the adoption and was told that the records remained closed from the adoptee's side. He had not filed a contact preference, which meant either he had not searched or had not yet found what the search returned, or had found it and decided not to make contact. We don't know. We may never know. There is a person in the world who is our brother by half, and we have no way to reach him. And he has no way to reach us except through a system he has not yet, or may never, choose to activate. I hold this with the specific quality of something that is open-ended, in a way that has no resolution available. Not painful exactly, not the acute pain of betrayal or loss, more like the awareness of an unfinished sentence in the story of my family, and sitting at the end of a paragraph that everyone else thought was complete. My mother and I have talked more in the years since she told me than we have in the previous decade combined. Something about the telling and the receiving of it, and the conversations that followed, about my father, about the decision, about what honesty costs and what it gives, has produced a closeness that the managed silence had, without anyone intending this, been preventing. We know each other differently now. I know her as someone who carried a significant thing with care and loyalty, and who finally, at 70, decided that the person she'd been protecting deserved to know what she'd been protected from. I love her for both parts of that. My father I know differently too, not less, not with less warmth, but more completely. The quietness in April was not absence, it was presence of a specific kind. The specific presence of someone holding something they couldn't put down, and had chosen not to hand to anyone who couldn't carry it yet. He handed it to my mother. My mother has handed it to me. I will carry it for whatever comes next, and I will try to carry it the way he did. Not as a wound, not as a secret, but as the true and complete shape of a life. That was more than the version of it I was given at first. That story is over. The April quietness is the detail that stays. The specific recurring gravity of a day that everyone else moved through as an ordinary day, and that carried a weight that never lifted in 43 years. The distinction the narrator draws between the withheld truth being offered with genuine care and that care not changing the fact that it was withheld is the most honest and precise accounting of how good intentions and real harm coexist in the same decision. The increased closeness with the mother in the years since the telling is the unexpected gift. Inside the difficult thing, the silence had been protecting and preventing at the same time, and the telling undid both. The reframing of the father's caring as a form of presence rather than absence is the most generous and most earned conclusion in the story. The one that requires having sat with the whole picture and chosen to see the person rather than to the omission, and the half-brother who may or may not find his way to them. That open sentence sitting at the end of the family story is the image I'll leave you with tonight. Not every story ends. Some of them just reach a point where the next chapter belongs to someone else, and all you can do is leave the door unlocked and hope they find it when they're ready. And that's where I want to leave things tonight. 30 stories about families, the people who were supposed to be the safe ones, the ones who knew you first and longest, the ones whose love was supposed to be the most unconditional available. And what every single one of these stories has in common is not the betrayal itself. It's what happens after. The people who told the truth when it cost them something. The siblings who made the call. The cousins who sat across coffee tables and said what they'd been sitting with for years. The grandmothers who called before they changed their minds. Every story tonight had someone in it who finally decided that the truth mattered more than the comfort of keeping it managed. And in almost every case, that decision, late, imperfect, sometimes arriving years after it should have, changed something that needed changing. Families are the first story we're given about who we are and what we're worth and how the world works. When that story contains something false, the work of finding the true version is some of the hardest work a person does. The people in tonight's stories did that work. Most of them are still doing it. And if you're doing it too, if something in tonight's stories felt less like entertainment and more like recognition, then I hope what you took from it is the thing that every one of these stories ultimately came back to, which is that the truth, even when it arrives late and costs something and doesn't resolve cleanly, is always better ground to stand on than the comfortable version of a story that was never fully yours. Get some rest. I'll see you in the next one.